We're back. The default is forward.
If you want, I don't know, there's a lot going on back there. I knew the
Oh,
other.
that's the tip. I feel it.
You gotta really
Push it. You gotta really work it to get it back. Okay.
salt and pepper that.
So later when I need to adjust my chair, you can help me.
Yes.
Yeah, when you can do it, it sounds like it's basically.
I did it. It wasn't awesome, but it's good, like good enough. Right now.
Everybody?
Enjoy your chairs. Oops. I'd like to convene the Minneapolis Park and Recreation Board here on Wednesday, August 16th. And if Secretary Ringel, if you would call the roll, I'd appreciate it.
Commissioner Thompson.
Here.
Commissioner Schaefer. Commissioner Olson.
Here.
Commissioner Musich.
Present.
Commissioner Menz.
Present.
Commissioner Alper.
Present.
Commissioner Abeni.
Present.
Vice President Crudup.
Here.
President Forney.
Here.
You have a quorum.
Thank you, Chair Dan. Okay, thank you. I will take a motion to approve the agenda.
So moved? Second?
Thank you. All those in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? My motion carries. Then on to 3, my goodness, sets of minutes. If somebody would make a motion to move all 3 of them, I'd appreciate it.
I'll move the slate of items under consent.
A second?
Second?
Okay, all those in favor,
Do you want to recognize the
President
secretary?
Forney, point of clarification. I think it was to move the minutes, not consent.
My bad.
did I say that or didn't I? Oh,
I thought you said
apologize.
consent.
Thank you. Okay, we are moving the approval of the minutes. All those in favor? All 3 sets?
Do we have to move the
Second?
minutes?
I'd like to move the minutes.
Great.
Oh, I
The
thought
slate
that
of
too.
minutes
I'm going to
from,
second them.
great.
Yeah, look at that.
Okay, we have been moved in second. All those in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Oppose? Action carries. Okay, reports of appointees to outside boards, commissions, or committees. And I see a light flicking on. Commissioner Abeni.
Thank you, President Forney. Just a quick update. There was an audit committee meeting on Monday of this week, on the 14th. And now it's developed staff team. It's the new structure, so they're now cooking along with the projects that they have in the adopted plan. And so they did there was a receive and file on another chunk of the multi-phase HR audit. There's no impact to MPRB for that one. And then just a general progress update report that was also received and filed. So that's it.
Any other reports? Okay, I will then report on 2 things that I'm very excited about. First of all is the blue line. I'm sorry, I don't get colors correct, so I always refer to it as the Botno line. So there was a meeting last week. Some of you might have read about it in the news and everything, but the project staff did come back with a recommendation to, instead of going down Lyndale Avenue North, to go over to Washington, and then instead of going down Broadway, to go down 21st Street. And the big, really exciting thing is the fact that they would be suggesting to build a new bridge over 94, and that would be for the light rail plus also pedestrian and bike. And then, yeah, that was the most important thing. Anyway, so that's a huge thing. And what I suggested was for us to look at having a land bridge over 94. And then also that the zoning that had encouraged the city to look at the zoning, which actually it was Commissioner Olson who suggested this to me and everything, basically to adjust that so that there's real concern in the community about displacement. So to what I've heard is to refer to it as land banking, so we can accommodate that community. From what I understand, the community was seated behind me is that was incredibly well received. So it's a really big change that seems to be favorable within the community. Our next meeting, which I'm sorry I don't have the date right in front of me and everything, is going to be, though, probably our biggest place to weigh in, and that is regarding the potential of a flyover at Victory Memorial slash Weber. Anyway, no, Victory Memorial Theater Worth. We have a great deal of voice in this with our 4F. So anything that, people can give me as far as information, insights on that, I would, but I believe that when they presented to us, whatever it was, like a month or so ago, they heard us, that we were not really excited about a 4-story flyover. So it will be very interesting what they come back with, and so I'm eager to move this forward, and hopefully they are really listening to the community. And probably the biggest thing, which I'm sorry I get so excited about, I'm sure all of you have heard about the mayor's address regarding the budget. He heard us, you guys. This has been so huge. I am so proud of all of you for all the work that you have done as far as teeing that up. And yeah, I mean, Superintendent Bangora commented that on other speeches or whatever, when he does the budget and everything, we're barely mentioned. We were mentioned numerous times and how important we are. So it's so exciting, and I just cannot thank enough everyone who worked on it. I know we called every council member, the mayor. The work that all of you have done is I so appreciate it. But I also, we would not have been able to even get remotely close to this without the due diligence of our staff. I am so proud of you all. I really am. I mean, Dan Elias, Deb Pilger, Rachel Crabb, Madeline Hudak. I mean, you guys laid the data to make the argument for us. And I cannot thank you. I'm just so proud and everything. Of course, Pamela Gokemeyer, Dawn Summers, and Cliff Swenson, and Adam Arvidsson, and of course, Jeff Evenson, but also our assistant superintendents, Michael Schroeder, and also Jeremy Barrick. Without you guys, we couldn't have done it. And I'm really excited that, how it's going to roll out. And thank you all. So kudos. So on then to our next agenda, the consent agenda. Yes, if I can have a motion to accept. No, yes, that's where we're at. We're at the consent agenda. But just a reminder, we do have a public hearing at 5:45. So can I have a motion to accept the consent agenda?
I'd like to make a motion to approve the consent agenda.
Second.
Great. Any discussion on this? Okay, all those in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? That action carries. Okay, moving along way too fast. So we are at unfinished business, pretty amazing. And so if somebody would like to move Resolution 2023-156.
I'll move Resolution 2023-156. Resolution receiving and filing as a permanent record with the Secretary of the Board, the annual comprehensive financial report of the Minneapolis Park and Recreation Board for the year ended December 31st, 2022.
Second?
Thank you. Anybody would like to have a present? We are going to have a presentation. Okay. I'm so glad to see you, Director Wiseman.
President Forney and Commissioners, I don't have a big, huge presentation, but what I'd like to say is that the Office of the State Auditor recommended that they not attend this meeting because we had a clean audit with no findings. The annual report was for fiscal year ended December 31st, 2022. The Office of the State Auditor performed our audit. For 2022, the MPRB did not need a federal single audit completed because the federal expenditures for that fiscal year did not exceed $750,000. In the auditor's opinion, based on their audit, the financial statements present fairly in all material respects the respective financial position of the MPRB. The finding from fiscal year 2021 was fully corrected, and in fiscal 2022, we had a clean audit with no findings. I would like to specifically thank Sue Fossey, the accounting manager, who leads the annual audit process, as well as all of my staff whose great work is reflected in this audit.
Thank you. I agree wholeheartedly. We've had some pretty, what should we say, challenging audits the past, probably a half a dozen years and everything. And so this is really remarkable. I appreciate it. And once again, thanks for your professionalism. So, any questions people have? Okay, then moving on, we will go then to, wow.
We need to accept the.
Thank you.
So we already moved and seconded it, yeah.
Yes, okay, so all those in favor of the motion, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Abstentions, or excuse me, opposed. Okay, it sounds like that action moves. Thank you. Carries. So we are then on to our discussion items. Boy, we just whizzing along here. So I believe that Deputy Superintendent Ringel will be presenting our naming policy update.
Thank you, President Forney, Commissioners. To help with this presentation, there are two handouts at your desk. One of them looks like this, and it has some markings crossed out on it. And the other one says draft naming policy on the top. And for those who are here, there are copies over there as well. But I think actually this first one that has the marker crossed out on it, this is actually, if there's no other reason to work on the naming policy, this would be the reason to work on the naming policy, is there isn't actually a naming policy in any of our current formats, in any of our current systems. So this is actually from, this is the version we use, but this is from 98 and 99 and has yet to be translated into our current system in our current format. So if there's no other reason to do this work, it's to lift that back up into a current format and have you formally approve that. So that's maybe item number one. And then this one is actually what we'll cover tonight. There's been a lot of conversation amongst this board about naming rights and naming, and it's come up obviously in several different resolutions. So really part of the purpose tonight is for you to get an understanding of the work we've already done around this and to contemplate maybe how we want to proceed with the work from here. So first of all, overall needs. I think, one of the things you do not have in policy right now is anything formal around naming rights. Any naming rights that you have provided over the years regarding any type of monetary donation have usually required you to suspend board policy in order to do it, right? So there isn't anything formal or consistent on that. So that's one of the big questions that'll be before you as a board. The other one, even if we don't go down that route, would be to actually get the existing policy that we use into a current format and have that be approved by this board. They should be approved every 5 years, and this one hasn't been touched since 99 and 98. And in that process, there are some glitches with that current policy that we'd love to correct or at least try to modify to make a few things easier. Everything from if it isn't a name of a person, does it have to wait 2 years to go through the nomination process, or can you move it forward more quickly? That would be a question we'd want to be looking at. And then right now, there is no way to easily exit out of a name within the policy, and that has come up for us as well. So there would be some modifications even to the existing naming policy if you don't want to add naming rights into it. And any of these policies you have in front of you have not to date had any real consideration through a racial equity lens. And since we worked on it since we worked on it in 2018, there's probably some land acknowledgement work. We should look at what the intersection would be there as well. So there is, even if you wanted to move forward with naming rights and we wanted to make the edits to kind of that existing policy, those are two probably big bodies of work we'd want to do to make sure that we are looking at a contemporary version of naming for our system. So why does this naming rights question even come up? Well, for the last 3 community surveys that we have done, so in 15, 19, and 22, you can see that anywhere from 75 to 82% of respondents have indicated they support the park board securing some type of revenue out of naming rights. You can see that maybe the I don't know for sure how to respond level of respondents has gone up from 2% to 10%, but we're still staying with a pretty strong support amongst community members that naming rights is something you could consider as a board, and you would likely receive some level of support from the public on that. Here's the exact question that we've asked all 3 times, so we haven't modified that question. I actually showed you an example of the image of how it's reflected on the in Chicago's Millennium Park in terms of the ice rink, but this is how we've asked it every time. And we do have current examples. And I actually articulated a sponsorship on here as well, because commonly this line between sponsorship and naming can get blurred a little bit. And we really think of sponsorship as kind of one-time, short-term, and there's typically a little bit more interaction around corporate names and things like that, whereas naming is really something much more enduring. So in terms of naming, we see examples of fields, pools, and other facilities bearing bearing individuals' names, as well as, or I shouldn't say as well as, but anywhere from 40,000 to 1.3 million is what we've secured for those different names on those facilities. To date, so there was a work group who started back in 2016 thinking about this after that 2015 survey, and actually had produced this draft naming policy by about 2018. And that work was put on hold at 2018, so this is just being repicked up at this point. And at the time, we looked at the National Park Service, Toronto, Chicago, Portland, and Seattle as examples. We reviewed all of the existing naming rights we had granted, and we talked with some of our key stakeholders, so individuals out in the system, organizations who we interact with, about what their thoughts might be around naming rights. The input where we would get agreement amongst commissioners and others is that really sponsorship and naming should be 2 different policies, so you won't see really anything about sponsorship. Sponsorship should really be a different policy. Regardless of what the name is, there shouldn't be anything that would prevent it going to the board as a vote, so there shouldn't be any administrative approval of names. It should all be a board-required approval. There should be some level of alignment with our mission with that donor, and then constantly wanting to look at what other systems are doing so that we're in line with those systems. There were several areas of disagreement that kind of kept popping up in the previous work. One was whether or not a naming right should also require an endowment for maintenance and operations of the facility that was being named after an individual, whether there should be terms for those naming rights, and then what would be the way that we would determine the value, like how much would you have to pay in order to actually secure a naming right. So the draft policy that you have does quite a few things. It establishes a consistent path for naming. It incorporates, with modifications, the current naming policy as well as this additional concept of naming rights. It retains the board's authority on all of it. It establishes what can be named, and we'll get into that in just a moment. It signals which donors we would be accepting donations from. So there's been some discussion of, hey, there are some donors who it just might not meet our mission. It might not be, we might not share the same values, and so maybe we wouldn't accept donations in that way. It provides an exit strategy, establishes a valuation method, assigns responsibilities for maintenance, and addresses concerns around branding. As you would look at this policy, you will see that there are two sections. One of them is really around non-monetary naming. So that's primarily what you do right now. Right now you do naming and you don't ask for there to be a monetary contribution. So that's pretty consistent with what we're currently doing, and this policy, this draft policy lays it out that non-monetary naming would be eligible for both parks and assets. So you can name something within a park as well as the park itself for a non-monetary situation. For the monetary situation, and that might, be cash in kind or assets, like somebody might be donating something to you and it has a value. That one really restricts it to assets only. In this policy, at least, it wasn't envisioned that you would be in a position where somebody could buy the name of a park. They could buy the name of an asset, but not maybe the name of a whole park. Again, this is where we were. It might not be where we go, but that's where we were exactly. I just wanted to get you up to speed in terms of where those were. So again, the non-monetary, the part that is most consistent with our current policy, is it really just enhances it a little bit. It adds that exit strategy in it. It adds some direction around duration. So if it is an asset, it ties it to a life cycle. It prohibits really explicitly the branding component and reduces barriers in attendance to public hearings and provides more direction to project managers. So the current policies and procedures are a little loose and kind of conflict a little bit, so we usually take the most conservative read of it, but this would help clean that up and provide a little bit more guidance to the project manager and make the public hearing process a little bit easier. So now we get on to kind of the really new topic, which would be the topic of bringing naming rights in a meaningful way into your policy as a board. As written, it really anticipates that you would approve naming requests that included donations from individuals or groups who were aligned with our mission and vision. Right? That would likely be a pretty great place to start, and you wouldn't see many barriers to that type of a request. But it also articulates some areas where you would anticipate declining it, and these might be areas where we have existing business relationships. At the time, we were really having a lot of conversations about tobacco, so we were also eliminated tobacco-related companies as being ones that we'd be working with, or illegal products. Something that might generate controversy because of around code of ethics or something around the value set of the company or the individuals that will be coming forward. And then any donors who we were in current or past litigation with. Those were things that we anticipated the board would not approve and might approve in extreme circumstances, but it would take quite a bit of scrutiny at the board level. You will see that it establishes a duration, and again, it doesn't anticipate naming parks for a donation. It really just anticipates naming assets for a donation. And when you think of an asset, clearly all assets have a life cycle. They have a point in time where either they're going to need to be replaced or maybe removed because they're no longer relevant. And so we didn't want a name to be something that would get in the way of you saying, hey, that particular amenity is no longer relevant to this community. I'm not going to perpetuate it just because somebody has named it. So it establishes that duration by which you would consider ending that naming. It also provides a a provision for permanent naming, which requires them to provide an endowment that goes along with it, with the concept that if you're going to get something beyond one life cycle, you're actually perpetuating it beyond one life cycle, so there is that endowment consideration for it. And then it gives exit strategies, and we have seen that more recently. Hey, we find out something about a donor, we find out something about, in our case, maybe the name of an individual who is on a park or an asset, and we decide that doesn't actually align with our value set anymore. So it actually provides a method by which we can say, we need to stop that relationship with that name. Or an active nature, something catches on fire, right? So you'd be able to get out of that agreement in that context, or changes in use. So the valuation thresholds that we were entertaining at the time, we considered both new assets and existing assets. And of course, the main difference between a new asset and an existing asset is one, you know exactly how much it's going to cost to construct it, so it's easy to figure out the value of it, whereas an existing asset, you have to go through a valuation process to figure out what the value of that asset is. But it looks at a minimum gift of $250,000, and if something, or 50% of the value of the asset, with 250 still being that base number. So it's a pretty high threshold, right? You're not establishing that somebody can get the name of a $4 million facility for a $100,000 contribution, right? You would be establishing that if you're going to get the name of a $4 million facility, you're probably contributing $2 million toward that asset, trying to establish that there's a high threshold to having a name that you're buying onto a facility. Again, that perpetual naming is really looking at if we're going to go beyond the life cycle of an asset and we're going to continue to perpetuate that asset with that name on it, having an endowment in place to maintain and take care of it beyond that life cycle. Maintenance, it's assumed that these assets are owned by us and that we would be maintaining them at the threshold consistent with how we maintain those assets across our system. If a donor felt like they wanted a higher level of maintenance or a higher level of care for that particular asset, we could allow them to contribute more for that, but we would be committing to keeping it with our means and how we're taking care of the system in general. Prohibits branding, so corporate logos, word marks, and any graphic identifiers. So really looking at a name versus a logo or a symbol that would be allowed within the naming rights component. So that gets to next steps. So one of the big indicators that would help us is to know if the board is even interested in pursuing naming rights. And if you are, we would continue to work on that path. We'd start reviewing and making sure that what we've put forward is still contemporary. But if you don't, then we would just focus on the existing policy and making that the best that it can be in addressing some of the issues we see in it. I think in addition to that, you know, one of the things that pops up more and more in general, and I know you've all received comments on this, is whether or not you even want to continue to name assets and parks after people. I think there's a fundamental question out there as well on that topic. So that would be good to know too, if you felt like that wasn't something you wanted to do, because that would dramatically change the scope of work that we'd be looking at from a staff perspective. We need to revisit those previous examples. We need to apply a racial equity lens and see how things align with land acknowledgement. We would, of course, have to do a community engagement assessment, and depending, again, on how big these changes are, we might be into a community engagement plan. Then establishing that review process, host a public hearing, and eventually bring that forward to you for approval. So with that, I will entertain questions, looking forward to where you might be on this topic.
Very timely. If it's okay with everybody, I think I'm going to move into open time. We do have a few speakers and everything, so I'm going to read the rules. Okay, first of all, So, thanks to all of you who want to share your thoughts and ideas with us during open time. Before we start, and I also should remind everybody, we do have a public hearing at time certain, 5:45. Anyway, to all of you who want to share your thoughts and ideas with us during open time, before we start, I want to provide an abbreviated version of the open time board rules. All individuals wishing to speak may call in before noon the day of the meeting to be placed on the agenda, or can sign up at the board meeting prior to the start of open time. I will be calling on people on the list, on the sign-up list only. Open time for public input shall not exceed a total of 15 minutes, with the time limit to be allotted by myself, the president. Please watch the timer up here to be considerate of others here to speak, and stay within your allotted time. During open time, public testimony will be given without debate, and only clarifying questions from the board will be allowed. Two types of items are not appropriate for open time in order to protect the privacy of all individuals, and those are pending litigation and personnel issue. Please refrain from commenting on specific personnel issues. We will not tolerate discriminatory or harassing words directed at anyone, so please ensure that all comments you make tonight comply with that policy. This board made the decision many years ago to operate under Robert's Rules of Order. Under Robert's Rules of Order, the ceding of time to another person is not allowed. So only those signed up on this to speak may only speak for their own allotted amount of time. We also request that each speaker provide his or her name and address. And so we do have 3 speakers. I'm going to start out with Gary Spears, and I'm going to give you 3 minutes each. The next person is going to be John Thomas. So is Gary here? Okay, I'll move then to John Thomas. Is John here? Oh my. Okay, I'm going to go then to Patricia Casco. Patricia, why don't you come forward, and we'll hopefully find Gary and John.
Okay, I have a handout for the board.
Yes, Dawn, who's right behind you and everything, can distribute those to us. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Patience Caso, and I've worked professionally on environmental and public transit and bike ped issues in Minnesota for more than 20 years. I'm a bicyclist, and I'm a gardener at Sioux Line Community Garden. And if you've been to our garden, you know it's an oasis in the middle of the city. It's the only natural green space in the area, and it provides food for hundreds of families. The county wants to add a very large bike path through the middle of our garden, and Sioux Line is full of gardeners, kids, seniors, dogs, and people wandering through. Adding fast-moving bicycles will make the garden dangerous. And digging up the contaminated soil under Sioux Line Garden will harm our health and destroy the chemical-free quality of our garden that has been maintained for the last 30 years. Research that we've seen has highlighted the vast benefits of community gardens, including improved health, food sovereignty, personal and social development, environmental stewardship, and climate resiliency. Community gardens also bring people together, and they help to reduce social isolation, as we all experienced through COVID. That's where I met a lot of my garden friends. Just this month, in the state of New York, legislators delivered a bill to their governor to increase protections for community gardens and designate them as critical environmental areas. This designation will ensure that when a garden is threatened by development, like the bike path that's proposed, decision makers fully consider the garden's unique and important characteristics and provide gardeners and community members with opportunities to participate in the decision-making process. Unfortunately, community gardens in Minnesota have no legal protections like this. And unfortunately, Hennepin County has not engaged us and the community around this bike trail. The county has better options, other options for this trail, and we know paving over nature has always been the easy answer, but it's not the right answer. If we want to create community, address climate change, infiltrate stormwater, protect pollinators, reduce food insecurity, and increase access to nature in our urban neighborhoods, we can preserve the Sioux Line Garden, and we can provide access somewhere else along the Midtown Greenway. It is possible to have both things. I hope we can count on your support to protect Sioux Line Garden from the Hennepin County Bike Trail, whether that's through your staff work or a decision that you might have to make here at the board. So thank you very much. I did want to just close with inviting you again to our potluck on Saturday, August 19th. It starts at 5 p.m. And we're going to have a big community stone soup salad. We are located at 2845 Garfield Avenue. If you are not sure of our location, we're right by Lyndale Avenue in the Midtown Greenway. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm still looking for Gary Spears and John Thomas. Anybody around? Anybody who looks like them? I'll just wait another couple of seconds. You see anybody coming out the door or close to it, Dawn? I hate to do this, but I will close then our open time and move on back then to discussion on our naming policy, and I have Commissioner Musich, please.
Thank you, President Forney. Deputy Superintendent Ringgold, from the time that we were putting on hold the 2018 draft policy, how many of the naming actions taken by this board would comply with the policy as written? And for those that don't, do we know the reason why they don't and why we chose not to follow the guidance, while not adopted, that was suggested at that time? I'm thinking as an example of Graco Park. We named that for a corporation that gave us money. The policy specifically would indicate that we didn't. I understand part of the reason we did that was because of the settlement in terms of a lawsuit. So, yeah, if we could, I think it would help inform thoughtful policy moving forward if we understood what this board has decided in recent years to name things and why we did it and why we chose to ignore the guidance that we've been provided. Because there's really no point in asking you all to put together a policy that we have no intention of abiding by. But I do think we need a naming policy. And there's a lot of good stuff in the draft that we have in front of us. So I would like to see us work on it, but I also want to be realists about it so that when people read a policy, they believe that that's the policy we're going to follow, rather than to assume that they're going to be able to do an end run around it by lobbying 5 commissioners on this board.
President Forney, Commissioner Musich, I do not have that information off the top of my head. I will
didn't
say,
think you would.
Most recently, we've been doing quite a bit to follow the existing policy when we get nominations, but that isn't around naming rights as much as it is around nominations for naming. But I would have to look at the numbers and bring that back. I'll do that and send it to all of you.
Thank you, I'd appreciate that.
Commissioner Schaefer.
Yeah, I'd like to have a little more description around what you detailed as asset.
Mm-hmm. President Forney, Commissioner Schaefer. So an asset is really any structure or amenity within a park. So it could be a building, it could be a path, it could be a playground, it could be a little amphitheater, it could be any of those assets or infrastructure that we would see within a park.
How about natural areas like a prairie or a section of woods?
President Forney and Commissioner Schaefer, I could see it extending to that as well.
And then has there been any guidelines around number of named assets within a park? Because I could see a path and a building and a playground and a, you know, at some point I think it gets cluttered. So I guess, is there any guidelines you've developed around number of naming in one location?
President Forney and Commissioner Schaefer, that is not something we've considered to date, but we could certainly include that.
Okay, those are just my initial thoughts. Thank you.
Commissioner, wait a second. Commissioner Benny.
Thank you, President Forney. So I'll need some time to, read this, because if I'm listening to the presentation, I can't read it at the same time. But couple things. So the survey is compelling. I would probe a little bit, and I'm glad you're asking the same question year after year, but I would probe a little bit for people why they would support that. Is it a personal reason that they think it will reduce their taxes or something like that, I would guess. But, and I don't think it necessarily really will. It'll do something else. It would probably maybe contribute to projects that would already be funded at a certain level with bonding, and the tax implication per person would be pretty minimal statewide. So I would like to hear from my constituents on this. I've heard a little bit, and personally, if I were surveyed, I wouldn't be so into naming rights, but I represent, Southwest, and so I would like to hear from people on that. In terms of naming rights, I also think I just took a couple of notes. I think that not parks is really important, that we would never give away the naming rights for parks, and I think that should be memorialized if we move forward with this. I get worried when I see things about companies that have to be aligned with the mission and vision that get subjective. Now maybe a board that's the entity that handles things that are subjective, but I like things to be a little bit more cut and dry, if at all possible, to take away opinion in a sense. Another thing, to the other naming issue, I actually don't have an issue with naming things after people, but I'd like to see a broader range of people now receive that honor. As we all know, so many people, only certain people were allowed to participate or contribute in society in ways that you would get a name, something named after you. And it's not that no one else was doing anything, they just weren't allowed at the table. So I have an issue with that. But other than that, I don't have an issue with names. And I want to point out one thing. I work at the university, as I say, and they just adopted a practice that says every 70 years, each named thing will be reviewed. And the first 4 buildings came up, and they put it out to the community to basically speak to each of the facilities in this case. So I think something like that, a sunset date, especially this is the non-monetary version, but that would allow, I think, not a reactionary approach, but a measured approach. And if something were coming up for, or something was changed or something like that, it would give the community time to kind of get there, I guess is what I'm going to say. And then lastly, back kind of bouncing around a little bit, but I do like the idea of the endowment for maintenance, but I also really like what you're saying about a building a facility having a life cycle and not having to perpetuate a name beyond, perpetuate a facility or an asset just because it's named. Thank you for letting me say all that.
Commissioner Mans?
Thank you, President Forney. I did also have, this document, the one with the cross out, that's not actually our policy, that's just, because if it says park sites, center shelters, has made a special contribution to the park board, we can name something after it. So would that fall under the, I'm really also concerned and confused about the Graco Park naming, and I know that's in my community, and we're about to ground break on it. Is there any context that we can get around that process and how maybe it was usurped because of the lack of a policy? Because I think that Commissioner Musich's comment, I was always confused about why it's named Graco Park as opposed to it's named after a corporation. And I can kind of see the link, but I'm confused. Can you give me some context, please, around that, how that came up?
President Forney and Commissioner Mentz, first I do want to make one clarification. This is our current policy. So everything in here is what we currently use. The policy is the first page, and the second page is the procedures. So that is currently what we use, and that is specifically for a non-monetary type of naming. So this isn't about naming rights. This is the convention by which we use to name. So all of the public hearings you've been getting around naming, that's all following this policy and procedure. I don't know that I'm the best to speak on Graco, and I would wonder if Council Rice would like to speak on Graco.
Sure, I could, Madam President, if I may. Someone mentioned it, Graco Park's naming came as a result of an action by this board that I believe was adopted unanimously in conjunction with the settlement of a lawsuit. The park board was in litigation. We, the park board, instituted litigation against Graco to condemn an easement along the western side of their property. My recollection was that we had estimated the cost of the easement at about $1 million, and Graco said it was worth $10 million. The litigation went on for quite a while. Mr. Schroeder is probably as knowledgeable as I was, over almost 30 days of hearings in the matter. In early 2018, I believe, the board then decided to make an effort to see if we could settle that litigation. I reached out to the general counsel of the Graco, and we talked about settlement. The litigation was settled by Graco donating the property, which had a value of anywhere between $1 and $10 million, and they made a donation of, I believe, $3 million to help build the park. And in exchange, part of the arrangement there was that Graco donated the land, both sides settled the lawsuit, neither side charged the other side for any legal fees. Graco offered the donation. We did sell land to Graco, which I think resulted in an additional $1 million around the edge of the park that they were concerned about, that brought some money back into the board. Graco, in addition to paying for part of the land on that site, also made the $3 million donation, also donated the land. My best estimate at the time, we could look back on the records, Graco probably made an estimated $5 million donation to the park board in terms of land and cash and payments. So that was, and then the board heard it, and Graco had asked that in exchange for the donation of the easement, their acquisition of the property and the donation of the land, that the park be named after them.
Thank you, Councilor Rice. I just have to interrupt because it is a public hearing at this point. I'm not sure, though, if there's anybody who is here to speak. It looks pretty vacant here, and I haven't seen John or anybody rush up. So do I even open up the hearing, at least?
Yes.
Okay, so I will, I'm not going to read the rules. Is that okay? Okay, all right. So I'd like to open up the public hearing regarding the naming, excuse me, I have to read it properly. Anyway, let's see now. This is our second public hearing for the Horace W.S. Cleveland Overlook naming nomination. So I opening it up, and no discussion, but I just want to make sure that we do have the district commissioner, and we have all three of our at-large commissioners. That is one of the requirements of having this. So I can close it now. All right. So if you're not finished, Councilor Rice, otherwise we'll move forward to Commissioner Menz and any more comments you might have.
Thanks for that context. I really appreciate that. So any naming policy that we approve in the future, I mean, would that, if we do some sort of sunset, would that impact Graco, and would that violate some sort of legal agreement, or do they have permanent rights to the name of that park?
I think it's 50 years.
President Forney and Commissioner Menz, at this point, any of the draft policies do not have a sunset on the name of a park. The sunsets are on names of assets within the park. I don't know what the actual settlement agreement says, if there are any clauses in it that would prevent it.
I think there was 50 years.
50 years, okay. And then there would be potentially, if there was something that would happen and we deemed we weren't in alignment, or there was some other issue, probably the exit policy or exit portion of the policy would likely apply. But I would defer to Council Rice if he knows any more about any limitations.
Wasn't it 50 years that it was?
Madam Chair, and to Commissioner Benz's question, I did confer with Mr. Schroeder. That issue came up in the Graco matter, and I can't recall if we put anything in.
We did.
Yeah.
I can't remember if it was 30 years or if it was 50 years.
Yeah.
Right.
It was some period of time.
Right.
But we'll find out and get back to you.
Right.
Thank you. I did have another question or two, or comment. I think that we're on the right track. I do I'm in between on naming things after people. I've gotten some feedback from constituents that makes sense to me that we shouldn't do that anymore, but I'm kind of I'm trying to figure out what would be good policy to do that, because I do agree that there are probably some people who have been forgotten from history who deserve some recognition. I'm also interested in maybe asking the president or the staff to also maybe review the sponsorship policy as well. I think that that's also a really important piece in this. Like, we're talking about big donors or names of large assets, but I think we sometimes miss the mark on allowing our local community to be involved in helping support their parks, and not in a difficult or like outward way, but as someone who goes to fields, I think that we should be looking at that policy as well, and what limitations we can have on that, but also what openness we could have with local businesses being able to support our parks and giving them some sort of recognition for that. And I think that that would be an important thing to review as we look at this naming policy as well. Thanks.
Commissioner Olson.
Yeah, thank you. Well, just first off to, I think, the question on the last side, I think definitely continue pursuing this. I think I am interested in supportive generally of a naming policy and being able to receive donations. For assets, I guess my one question or maybe clarification or maybe suggestion in this is, so if there's like a new asset up there, obviously it kind of seems like the gift is intended for that asset. Is that something, would we consider it maybe just going to the general fund in general? And like they say, well, we want this asset, okay, that asset costs this much. Does it have to go to that asset, I guess? And I'm just kind of envisioning in some ways, what if, folks are really only asking for naming in certain areas of the city, making sure that there's kind of equitable whatever. I mean, but maybe ultimately it doesn't matter because we would save funds and we would be able to use those funds on other parts of the assets. I guess I'm wondering if you think that needs to be defined, or if it's self-evident that it's for that specific asset or for the system as a whole.
President Forney and Commissioner Olson, I think that's a question that we would need to take a little bit of a deeper look at, honestly. I think when it's a brand new asset, it's clearly that you're adding likely to a capital project, and that's pretty straightforward, right? It's going into that particular project. I think in a situation where somebody wants to buy a name of an existing asset, I think that's a really important question for staff and commissioners to think a little bit about. Does that go into a dedicated fund for specific type of work? Does that go into the general fund to address one-time type of expenditures, recognizing that that isn't an ongoing funding stream, it's really a one-time giving, and so you wouldn't want to, say, hire staff off of those dollars, because you wouldn't have it wouldn't be a guaranteed funding stream. But I think especially naming of existing assets is a conversation that we would want to have to find the right spot to put those dollars.
Yeah, I would just kind of want to make sure that we have that defined, because I wouldn't want it to be something where, even if it's a new asset, because we're getting more funding for an asset, that we put more into that asset rather than, let's say, keeping it at an original thought of a budget, like we were going to do 10 million, but then someone was going to name it, and so now we're going to make it a $12 million one. Rather, take those savings, what we have, and put it throughout the system or whatever. Just thoughts there. And just kind of on a little different side of Commissioner Benny's thoughts on wanting to kind of be specific of what our goals or views or what have you. I think I'm okay with it being a little more loosey-goosey, and then the commissioners, if it's kind of in a gray area of whether or not it is supportive of our goal or whatever, the commissioners can kind of then make that decision. Although, I do agree that defining it could be good as well. But I think I may be a little more on the other side there. And that's about it. But I appreciate this, and I also appreciate the the aspect where not every at-large commissioner has to be there, as someone who as a cause for some heartache earlier with that. So thank you for this.
Thank you. Commissioner Thompson.
Thank you so much, President Forney. I just want to echo some of the things I've heard here. I really I think we need a naming policy, just because a lot of people are talking about things. And it seems like some of my questions were answered in terms of, I know that there are some things coming up or things that I've just heard that it's wanting to rename historic assets, so they wouldn't necessarily be a sunset on that, because there wouldn't be any wear out, because there's things that we're already kind of have as a sort of protected buildings or spaces. Then I find that something that we really need to be specific on what that is. As far as naming after people, I would concur with some of the thoughts I'm hearing up here, that I think that should be very much limited and have very specific things. I'm seeing the current policy says just 2 years, but it says another thing on whether they're, with us or deceased, or just from the time it's being nominated. And something about that strikes to a lot of different things that I've heard, in some desires and community inputs of that. It's just a real fast wanting to name it for someone who did some contribution. And I think we should really be careful of that sort of, whenever there's a loss in community, people want to honor people in a certain way, but maybe we should add in like time frames and be incredibly specific as to what qualifies toward that. Those are my only thoughts. I feel like I'm echoing a lot of what people have already said. It's bubbling up of some of the things going forward. And I do think, as Commissioner Olson said, like these multiple hearings and these conversations about naming, I think it's really important that we do share with community, like, this is the threshold. Because right now, sometimes it feels like we're entertaining a lot of stuff, and then when we have the public hearing and we get the presentations, and it's all very, very important. I'm not saying that it's not, but because we're not as clear on what qualifies, we spend, at least the first year and a half of our tenure here together, spent a lot of time on this dais listening and dissecting and getting the emails and being responsive. Whereas I think when we have something really clearly delineated, it'll diminish some of that stuff and maybe help speed up the process. At least that's my hope. So those are 3 cents I threw in the bucket.
Vice President Crudo.
Thank you. A couple questions, or just a couple of reiterations of what was already stated. I do love what Commissioner Benny said about the university kind of reevaluating the names after X amount of time. I think that is important. And I think the piece about the people who have been forgotten or forbidden to be in spaces is really critical, especially what everyone has brought up in terms of the equity piece, because what we could see is a lot of investment in one half of our city versus the other, just based on the economic means of those said community members who maybe have a leg up in estate planning or even know about that process, which becomes really critical. And we'll highlight kind of the haves and the have-littles of our city, which we see all too often. And so I think that is really important, that as we are discussing that we have that embedded in what we do, not just in writing it to say, oh, we're doing this, but we're doing it in practice. Because I do think that there are community members that have come before us, that we stand on the shoulders of, that have made great contributions, but literally folks in community who are doing the work have no idea how to engage or honor those said individuals through a process like this. And so some sort of FAQ, even for community, to bring forth these sort of ideas and naming rights, I think is really important. And then what Commissioner Menz was talking about in terms of the sponsors and those sorts of things, I think that if we look at some of these temporary places for these corporations to be invited into our spaces, that we maybe solve some of the inequity issues that we're facing right now, in particular with just girls softball. If there was I don't know, if Coca-Cola came and said, hey, we would pay for these things, but could you name this field after us? It's a temporary use or whatever the case may be. So putting some sort of term limit on it, but it takes the financial burden off of the system and maybe allows for other folks who have the means to come in and support some of the things that we're talking about. And so I think that we're on the right track. It is important that we have a policy, because without a policy, we perpetuate the same thing, and then we'll find the next group of commissioners sort of trying to undo something that we discovered, oh, this person was a terrible human, they had this secret life, and now we have to kind of undo the naming of this place, this institution that people have taken a liking to and identify with proximity. And so I think that absolutely, but we have to be intentional and kind of really tease out a lot of these things. So thanks for the work on this so far. I appreciate it.
Commissioner Schaefer?
Yeah, just to piggyback on Vice President's thoughts, I think one way we could consider exploring preventing some of that is to even have a board approval up front of the projects that we would consider for naming rights. Maybe that's cycles every 5 years, or as we look at the CIP coming out, or looking backwards with our asset management of some key places that really need capital investment. But I think that's a way that we could embed some of our equity work up front and really say we're going to have these 10 assets that we're going to consider. So it's not a random, I'm coming up and I have, I love this place, because we do receive a lot of gifts. And I don't want us now to have this expectation within the public that every time I come with a gift, I expect a naming right. And I know it's a large threshold, but I think that's a way we could have board approval at the front end and at the back end of, these are our targeted projects. We're going to narrow the scope. We're not just throwing this open to anything. And then also a board approval at the end. And then also intentionality about, hey, we know the community. Who would really be great to approach about this in a proactive way that could really be a good fit for this particular project?
Thank you all for the discussion. Somebody who's the oldest, I think, in the room, I was of the upbringing that you didn't name things, and so when this started to come on, whatever, over 20 years ago and everything, I was so against it, so completely against any naming. It just went against everything that I had been built in. But I do believe that we need, yes, the policy, we have that and everything, but we do need to have it because there has been, in particularly Commissioner Musich and my experience and everything, too many times that we have, bastardized it. And that has been very problematic to me, that we've made more exceptions than we have made the rule. And so that's what I would really want us, one particular one happens to be the Croning, Nature Center? And just one word we wanted to change. Anyway, that's a 2-year process that we're going through, shall we say, unnecessarily. But then we do have, we just in fact had our hearing regarding the Cleveland Overlook. And I'm grateful that the timing is working, that we will be able to hopefully, pass that. Anyway, there's good and there's bad, and that's the reason why, to me, I want to make sure that we have some teeth if we're going to, quote unquote, allow this. We have, I guess in some ways, I would think that if we could have maybe a list of what is presently in the queue right now, I think might help people do some reflection. As to, what are we about? I think you Commissioner Schaefer asked, what about a nature area or a meadow and everything like that? We have Annie Young Meadow. Anyway, so there's been so much that we've already been doing it. Let's make sure that we have something that we can hold that's codified and people understand it, and as Vice President Crudup says, how do we get the word out to people that this isn't quote unquote either opportunity or, we all know we can get a memorial bench, you can get, a tree, things like that. Anyway, monetizing it, still goes against my grain. So I just need to say that. It's a difficult thing for me, to deal with. But if somehow we can put a racial equity matrix into it, I don't know what that would look like. To me, could maybe help in my resistance to this happening. So unless there's any further discussion, hopefully there's a little bit of information to give you some guidance for moving forward. I thank you for the discussion here, Deputy Superintendent Ringel. And so we will move on then to our next agenda item, another discussion item about our racial equity study item series about the LL law. Very appropriate after, I think, the naming policy. So Angela, welcome. So glad that you're here, and carry on. By the way, I forgot to mention, when is the next public hearing for the Cleveland? It's October, what, like 16th or 18th? Sorry. Okay, so just FYI, at-large commissioners and district commissioner.
Sorry, President Forney, commissioners, there are no more public hearings
Okay.
on the Cleveland renaming. Those are complete. In October, you will receive the first opportunity in committee to approve it, and then if it advances from there, we anticipate it being on the full board on October 18th.
Awesome. Okay, thank you.
Hello, good evening, President Forney and Commissioners. Thanks for hearing us tonight. I'm Angela Salisbury, Archivist and Records Specialist here at MPRB. Here's my colleague.
I'm Joe Ayers, the IT Database and GIS Analyst here at MPRB.
So today's presentation is part of a series requested by the board to report on work done toward the 2023-2026 Racial Equity Action Plan. Tonight, we will present on the LL law, which is just one sliver of the work that is being done across the organization in regards to racial equity. If you are interested in reviewing the plan in more detail or want the latest updates, it can be found, just as a reminder, on our website under About Us and Racial Equity. You'll see the key documents there are linked, including the most recent updates to the plan. Research on LL law has been sort of broken into a couple of line items, so if you want to explore that some more, I encourage you to take a look. So when I started as Park Board Archivist about 2 years ago, I was asked to investigate the history of the LL law. So in the next few minutes, I'll try to briefly talk about what I have learned about LL law and why it is a part of our racial equity work here at MPRB. And then Joe and I will show you the tool that we have created for bringing these resources together. So a digital exhibition and an interactive map, which combine the archival resources that we have found with GIS technology, and we're hoping will serve as a finding tool for further exploration of LL law as a topic of research. So, and at the end, we'll have time for questions and feedback, and would very much like to hear from you. So. Established as a Minnesota general law in 1911, LL law is an act relating to acquisition of lands for streets, parks, and parkways in cities of the first class and the improvement and government thereof. It's named for Senator James T. Elwell, its originator, and he was a resident of Minneapolis and a real estate developer. The Elwell law, as it's commonly referred to, is basically defined and refined the process for financing parks through special assessments. So that means that the cost of acquiring land or improving upon land to develop a park was passed along to the property owners living in the vicinity of that land or that park. Though this process of financing city projects and roads had been used by both the City Council and the Park Board prior to 1911, The original Park Act of 1883 and the subsequent special law of 1889 afforded the Park Board the ability to acquire property through assessment of benefited properties, and the Elwell law basically codified the process. It specified the role of the city engineer and the commissioners, and it also outlined the process for landowners to appeal. So according to Elwell law, upon the Park Board's resolution to acquire land for a park, a group of appraisers would examine a prospective property and determine how much it was worth. That total cost was then split amongst property owners in that area. The owners of properties adjacent to the park, who were deemed as receiving the most benefit from that new park, were to bear the largest costs. And as you moved further away from the park, your benefits diminished, and so did your assessment cost. So I also want to clarify that when we talk about benefits, that was construed as real monetary benefit. So parks increased property values, so that increase in the value of your assets were being accounted for in those assessments. Total assessment costs were spread over a period of years, typically 10. In some cases, costs were assessed for an acquisition, and after that time period passed and that had been paid off, there was sometimes an additional assessment made for improvements to the park, such as grading or the building of the playgrounds. Here on the screen, I have two kind of examples of assessment plans. The one on the left is Nicollet Field, circa 1916. These aren't dated, but I'm guessing Nicollet Field, it's now King Park. And these images are available on the Minnesota Digital Library site, so they're publicly available. We partnered years ago with the Minnesota Digital Library, and they digitized some of our collections. So this one's interesting because you can see those sort of concentric circles. Closest to the park, those lots are deemed $80 per lot, and as you move further away, you can see further it's $20 per lot is what the assessment was there. On the right side, a suggested assessment for proposed playground at Longfellow and 39th Street. That's where Sibley is now, which was acquired in 1922. So kind of guessing that's the date of this. And this one's kind of interesting because you see on the bottom there are some sort of calculations, kind of splitting up what our assessments, what the needs were. Total number of lots, 2,500. At $40 per lot, this provides about $100,000. So assessments would range from $20 to $100 per lot. So two kind of examples of how that worked. So when looking at the history of the use of Elwell law assessments, I think it's been useful for me to understand the historical context of the time and when they were used. So the Minneapolis park system was experiencing very high demand at the turn of the century. It really outstretched the resources that the park board had for acquiring land, especially in the populated areas of Minneapolis. And also following the economic hardship of the Panic of 1893, where the park board really didn't have any money to buy those parks. And David Smith does a really great job of kind of talking about this in his book, City of Parks, and going into more specifics there. But I think what Elwell law did is it offered a solution. So to have citizens pay for their own parks, basically. In 1945, Theodore Wirth wrote a history of the park system, and he reflected on his use of the use of Elwell law. And he said it was, quote, a real bonanza for growth. He wrote about an example where he would attend neighborhood meetings and explain to community members there that if they were to wait for city money or for city bonds to be approved, quote, their children would be parents of children before they had their park. But with special assessments, they would have their playground within 2 years, which he said was a very effective argument. Charles Dole was the park engineer under Wirth, and he was later superintendent. And he wrote about this process a lot. He wrote about it in the national publications for Park and Rec magazine, and he shared this information with other cities. And he said later on, he had left some oral histories and said that without the Elwell law, it really would have been difficult, if not impossible, to acquire and equip the number of playgrounds and parks that we have. So. However, not everyone wanted to pay for parks. So, and it has been demonstrated that communities that were unable or unwilling to pay for parks did not receive them. I think park administrators were aware of the growing imbalances in park resources as early as the 30s and 40s. In 1944, Liebert Ware was the field secretary for the National Recreation Association. He was invited to come and do a review of recreation services. He found a, quote, deficiency in the availability of parks. He published a report, and it was printed in the 1944 annual report, and there's an image here of places that he was recommending parks or playgrounds. It's hard to see, but there are these rectangles that say, put a park here, put a playground here. And this was published in the annual report that the park board produced. The system was basically examined again in 1965. What we have come to know as the Bright Bill study specifically said that the use of Elwell law to finance parks was contributing to inequities and should therefore be minimized. And it was finally at the January 3rd, 1968 meeting of the Park Board that neighborhood parks were declared an essential public service, and they should be financed by citywide funds, and it was essentially the end of the use of Elwell law. So, ongoing research. The work of understanding the impact of Elwell law and the use of special assessments continues. And what makes this research challenging is that each park's acquisition was influenced by a variety of factors. Sort of every park had a case-by-case sort of scenario in terms of how to finance it. Whether there were petitions or requests from residents, whether there was the availability of tax-forfeited land from the state, if there was leftover money from something else, those kind of all have come together in different ways. So it's difficult to sort of generalize why assessments were used or when they were used in one case or another. But what we can do is to make this primary source research easier to undertake and sort of lower that barrier for the access to the collections that are available. Ultimately, I have the belief that it's access is also an equity issue. If we make access to collections a little bit more, approachable, easier for people to understand how to find resources, where are the resources, then we can help them on their own research journey, basically. So to do that, Joe and I have created this online tool. It brings together the historical narratives that have been written and are on our site, but are kind of all over the place. It brings those together with an interactive map of park acquisitions. It will include links to digitized annual reports, key resources like the Ware and Bright Bill studies, and also it'll include contact information for how to get in touch with me if you're going to undertake this research yourself. So I think I'm going to step aside. I'm going to let Joe give you the tour of the tool. We built this on the, I'll trade spots with you.
That's a good idea.
Yeah, we built this on the ArcGIS platform using historical data that we had available in the archives.
Okay. As Angela said, this is built on the Story Maps platform, which is part of our big GIS platform here at the Park Board. So to kind of start with the beginnings of this story map, I was kind of contacted, hey, can we do something like this? And it grew and grew and grew into something really tangible and usable that all can use. So I think some of this, I'm kind of shocked how, not to be just amazed, really not shocked, but amazed on how we can put all this stuff together in a usable format. And using GIS throughout my career, this is one of the more interesting and exciting things I get to do. Not just points, lines, and polygons. It's kind of telling a story, and that's kind of just energizes you, and you can kind of tell I'm kind of ready to go with it. But so yeah, I just kind of wanted to showcase a little bit this tool. This tool is still under construction, but I think we're at a good spot with it, and just that's why we're here today. So A lot of this stuff was kind of scattered, like Angela said, scattered around the whole webpage. And David Smith's book, and we're just trying to distill that down into a kind of more of a focused story. So it's scroll-based. If you scroll through, kind of introduction, beginnings, you can kind of read. I kind of use the template of an old newspaper as the map template, and you can see this good picture of Worth here. That same assessment plan. As this is available for everyone to look at, we'll make sure this is published and notify where this is on our website as well. So yeah, that's kind of the different graphics you can put in. If you want to skip the narrative, which why would you do that? You can go to the map itself, and this is where I kind of was brought into the project because of the mapping. The story was all Angela, so I'm like, why am I involved? Why would I be part of this? But I'm so glad I am. So this is, we had to focus it on the first 50 years because of the technology only holds 100 points. And we wanted to tell the story of all 200 plus parks that we have. So just initially, we're just going to tell the first 50 years and how each park was acquired. So that's kind of one of those decisions as you're growing this map. You're like, okay, why can't I do 100? And we have 200. Do we split it in pieces? So that's where it's like, I would say it's still a little bit under construction, but yeah, you can go, we kind of have it sorted by year of acquisition. So you can go, you can click on here, just it'll zoom to each of the parks, and some of the parks don't exist anymore, which is kind of interesting, like freeway acquisitions, like 394 being put in, you're like, okay, where's that park? But then the name changes throughout, and kind of tying that into the name changes earlier, you can see we have the older names in a lot of the narratives too. So the intention of this is just kind of get you excited about the history of the parks and the Elwell law, and then have a one-stop shop for resources. I think this will be, as this database matures, we can definitely use it as, okay, let's put the final Excel or map file in this map and use it as like a hub of resources for this. But yeah, I kind of have, it's kind of funny, you can scroll around each park. Resources, like Angela mentioned, we have quite a bit of resources and links to those resources, and we'll make sure everything that we mentioned before is in this map as well. And also, we're kind of toying the idea of like doing a little analysis. That's kind of just the narrative, and kind of, I'll show that briefly here. Kind of just how, and then we can filter each one, like how it was acquired, and you can filter.
This is where it gets really
Yeah.
interesting, because you can start to see, across a certain time span, how many parks were acquired with assessments, how many parks were donated, how many parks were transferred from the state. When people learn in different ways, and to be able to visualize it this way has been really interesting. So, and as Joe mentioned, it's our full intention to make this data available. So to download a CSV file or to have access to the GIS information, this is going to be part of this kind of information hub. So.
And this is all part of our platform, and this one is just, was LWAL assessments used or not? So you can kind of go on. And the biggest point is it's all over the city. There's not just one area. I thought when we were getting into this project, it'd be certain areas of the city that would be really concentrated, but as we've gone through just the first 50, it's everywhere. So like the bonanza of park acquisition, I think that really kind of proves, the data is kind of starting to tell that same story, so. But yeah.
So our goal is to have this up hopefully by the end of the year, so. Yeah, and I guess that's what we have, so.
Portal on our website again?
I'm sorry?
Where is the portal, or where will it be on the website?
Yes, that is a very good question. We haven't quite figured that out
Okay.
yet. But hopefully, we'll be able to point to it from a couple of places.
Yeah. So, wonderful presentation. This is so important to me. I really, really appreciate it. Questions, Commissioner, discussion? Yes, Commissioner Menz.
Yes, I was wondering if your work coincided with some of the mapping prejudice work that's been done in the city. Like, did you have connection, or was there guidance from there? Or is there any way to sort of combine how the parks were acquired along with the redlining that has been done in the past?
President Forney and Commissioner Mentz, good question. That's a question I think researchers across the city are kind of looking at this, why did parks develop in certain areas? How is this working? And we've had some of the researchers from that group come into the archives, and I've been in touch with them about what our collections are. And what's a little bit challenging is that we don't have any publicly accessible finding tools that kind of talk about what our collections are. It's public data, it's available, but we don't have a traditional finding aid or database that people can search. So it's really me and working with researchers kind of as a liaison. So I do that, and we make appointments, and they come here and are welcome to look at whatever we have. So yes, those researchers have been here, they're welcome, and my hope is that we can, through their work and our work, we can sort of share this information, more broadly too. Yeah.
That's okay. Commissioner Bennett.
Thank you, President Forney. Just a quick thing. First, I'll say I'm so grateful. Well, thank you for the presentation. Very interesting. I'm so glad that there's an archivist position here at the Park Board. Our history here is so, we have to keep it, and we have to know it and learn it, and keep getting better, right? So I have a question though. So I have actually of course the David Smith book, which is great, and then I also did get a copy that was given to me as a gift when I became a commissioner by my sweetie, of that Theodore Wirth book. And I think that's the book where he talks quite a lot about the acquisition fee, right? So, and it seems to me that was very much the embedded practice starting 140 years ago, right? That is how they built the parks, other than getting big land donations and things like that. Is that true?
President Forney and Commissioner Benny, that I believe that to be the case. Yes,
okay.
It was really the practice, and it seemed like it was an inherited practice. From the very beginning, our first parks, Loring Park was one of the first 3 that we acquired, and it was done with assessments, the same kind of thing. You assess the neighborhoods for the money, and I think it came out of this tradition of doing that for roads. In the 1890s and 1900s, they were starting to build roads for carriages and things, and that is how the city would fund those municipal projects.
Okay,
so
that's what I recall, and it was striking to me because it surprised me. I thought, oh, that's a weird mechanism for building a park, but it must have been something they did in Maine, right? Because weren't all the founders here from Maine? But anyway, but this map will only begin at the beginning of the Elwell Law. So I could see actually the Board of Commissioners trying to figure out this is becoming unpopular, how do we memorialize this mechanism in a law or something like that. Anyway, it's really interesting. I can't wait to goof around in the story map, so thank you very much.
Yes. And President Forney and Commissioner Benny, I'll point out that we sort of refer to assessments a little bit more generally, so that even those early parks before 1911, if they used an assessment, that's toggled as yes assessment. So that will be part of it. And this data set basically comes from a chart we found in the back of an annual report that had a list of all of the parks, whether it was purchased with assessments, if it was donated, if it used city bonds, and then very specifically which city bond it used. This is in the 1932 annual report, but I meant to bring a copy to show you, but it's on that very thin paper. I don't know if you've seen the old annual reports that was folded up and tucked into the back. And so you wouldn't you wouldn't necessarily find it if you were flipping through the annual report, and sometimes those were missed if they were digitized. We have a lot of our early annual reports are available online through the Hathi Trust Digital Library, and it's amazing. They were all digitized by Google Books, but they were just opened and flattened, and so those folded charts are not digitized. They were basically skipped. So you see there's something in there, but you can't tell what it is. So we took that data, we digitized it, and then we also visualized it. So.
Thank you. This has been very important to me, to know about this and everything. Being a realtor, I understand the value that parks definitely bring. I understand the positive, but at the same time, also the negative that's come as a result of it. And I am just so grateful for former Commissioner Anita Tabb, who made it a practice while she was on the board and everything, that anybody who would come to want to donate something, okay, she would say, fine, I'm perfectly happy to take your donation. One of them is the Good Chair Project and everything, but equal amount I want you to put into an underserved area. Anyway, that she did in several areas, okay. We've done it, like say, with the clay courts, anyway, number of places. And I guess what I would really love coming out of this is some sort of a policy that, as far as when we are gifted, whatever it is, that we have that philosophy, that practice and everything put into a policy, that a racial equity matrix, to make sure that the balance is there, to make sure that our entire city is equitably served. And so that's something I would love to come out of this. I love your passion, Angela. This is great. And I'm glad that you got into it, or Joe, that you got into it as well. So it is very exciting to understand where we cometh from. And I would like to set into place where we go in our future. So not seeing any other lights, we will then move into back into open time, because we do have one of our speakers did come forward. If it's okay with everybody, I'm going to ask Gary Spears if you'd like to come forward, and I'll give you a couple of minutes to be able to speak to us.
Yeah. Hello, everybody. My name is Gary Spears. And I come from the Crow Creek Nation, Dakota Nation. That's where my mom resides, came from. And basically, I've been come to the Sibley Park meeting since they opened up renaming in January of 2022. And our family's lived in that neighborhood since 1986. We also have a bad history where Lincoln, Sibley, and Ramsey were all part of hanging Dakota 38 and removing us to Crow Creek, South Dakota, which wasn't there before 1863. So it was a large mass execution in U.S. history. And so I definitely jumped to that chance to change and remove that name there. And lately, I just told some of them that there was a glitch in the social media there where we couldn't, by way of social media, we found out I was telling people to go to that site to pick the survey name there, and they found out they couldn't get into there because there was a technical glitch. But anyways, it's very important, that we have most Native input, because I feel this is a Native issue. This is an issue where Sibley, murdered, massacred a lot of people. They removed people down to Fort Snelling, which was a concentration camp before it was ever called a concentration camp. So, we asked some of the people, when I talked to Bianca and Said and them, who are behind the project, to name why did they remove him, and also a good idea of what happened to the people. And, we came up with a name with Chante Tiza Wian, which is strong-hearted women. And what I found on the history is, as they moved people out to South Dakota, they also moved the men separately to Nebraska. So they left the women with the kids alone there by themselves after all the removal and the murder that's happened, which they would have to be very strong. I believe that's a lot more meaningful and has a story behind it than some of the other names. Some of the other names, I know that was a way that they wanted to go about figuring out through a survey, but the survey, I was wondering where is it going out to? Who is it all reaching out to? Is it reaching out to a lot of non-Native American people, making the choices on removing somebody who was involved in a massacre, and where we had removal, and which is the main issue why I come to you guys today. And I hope you guys consider that soon, of changing the park name, because it really doesn't have any place in history, and definitely leave a message as to why he was removed. And when they put a name down there, it should have some kind of meaning, a story behind the people that were there, because that's all we're really asking after all that's happened. Well, thank you for listening to me today.
Thank you, Gary. And if you have any further questions, I'm going to let you speak with Assistant Superintendent Schroeder over there, who's been overseeing that process of the renaming. Okay, on that, then I am going to move to petitions and communications. Hopefully I didn't forget anything, people. Okay, I'll start with Commissioner Olson over there.
I will pass.
Commissioner Bene.
I will pass.
Commissioner Thompson.
Pass.
Commissioner Musich. Pass. Commissioner Elper.
Thank you, President Forney. I just want to speak to the great partnership that we have between the Park Board and the Sane Foundation addressing food insecurity at Corcoran Park. Sane Foundation, they do a lot of work with kids. They won the Living the Dream Award, that we gave to them back on MLK Day, and spoke a lot to their work with the food distribution that they're doing at Corcoran Park. And I had the chance to witness this in action this past Friday, and I just want to share with you, it was an amazing operation there. They serve about 250 to 300 families weekly. It's overwhelmingly local. It's lots of immigrants. I think it's approximately 900 people in total. They received funding from the Minneapolis Health Department to do this, and what I found particularly impressive is the amount of fresh food that they provide. They do this also at Conway Park in St. Paul, so I think we're incredibly lucky to have them at Corcoran Park, and they provide really a great service to people in need. That's what I want to share. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Schaefer.
Yeah, in case you didn't see it, Southwest Voices had an article about the Street Reach team and their work in Stevens Square Park. And it was a great article, so I'd encourage you to read it. I'd also like to thank some other people who were not mentioned in that article, and that would be Chief Ohado and the Park Police, who really work in tandem with our community outreach, because they can enforce they can enforce the ordinances that we have around drugs and alcohol, which the Street Reach team can't. And so I just want to say thank you to them, because I know they had increased patrols. In particular, Officer Carl Zabinski. Really, the team took a personal interest in that space because it was not accessible to the community. It had become inaccessible, just people didn't feel comfortable going there anymore. And so really, and then also Becky Lewis, who was at that time at Whittier Rec Center, really gave a lot into programming in that space. And so I just wanted to call those people out publicly. And it was a great article, but there was a few others that should have been mentioned. So just thank you to everyone, to the whole team, for the success that happened and will continue to happen, bringing accessibility to that space. And then I also will encourage the public and commissioners, if you didn't read in our petitions and communications the 2023 Department Budget Action second quarter update, I would just skim that. It's really exciting, and I want to say thank you to staff for all of the good work that is detailed in there. And I'm really excited for where we're headed with that. Two concerns within there that I had that I think resonate for what we hear as commissioners that would be great, maybe President Forney, we could get a report on, was the Park Police report detailing that traditional levels of service are not being met currently because of our staffing. I would be interested as commissioners, how is that affecting our safety in the parks? And is there any way that we can, as commissioners, really encourage them. And I have still yet to get on my ride-along this summer, but I know that was one thing Chief had told us earlier. But, you know, in that report, it says vacancies are running 30% under the budget allocation. And so I would love to hear a report on that. The other second concern that I saw in there was, and there's probably a fuller picture to this, but the lifespan data work by Director Arvinson showing that only 336 out of 643 analyzed MPRB assets are within their lifespan. 52% of our assets are within their lifespan. And that, again, touches our maintenance that we've really heard a lot about from. So I would love to hear a report on that, too, when the time is right. But thank you, Director Arvinson, for your work, and you could give maybe some input into that I did not see. That was it. Thanks.
Commissioner Meds.
Thank you, President Forney. First of all, I'd like to say that I think that a public call for more collaboration with the school board. We had our school board and park board meeting yesterday, and I felt like there was a lot of real positive energy around moving forward in a direction that really helps the young people of our city and working together. We are very much intertwined, and the success of our school system is very dependent on the success of our park board and the relationships that we develop. And I felt really positive walking out of that meeting, and I hope that we can find a couple of commissioners who will work with a couple of other board elects from the school board to sort of move some policy forward, and maybe even look at that MOU and look at those collaborative agreements. So that's kind of I'd formally like to ask the president to look at who we could have go. Also, I'd like to bring to the board's attention some issues that might not come forward. And I listened to some grievances from some officials in our organization. And for someone who's involved in sports and involved in fields and all this stuff, coaches are so important to the process of developing young people in our park system and in our city. But I think that a lot of times we forget about the officials who perform and work these games. And unfortunately, we have not done a good job of taking care of them. And I think that it's really important for us as we go into budget season to look at those line items and think, this is not a lot of extra funding that we should give to officials, but a lot of times officials are not only managing the game and trying to keep it safe and fair for the players, but also for the community. And we ask these people to do a lot. And sometimes we even ask them to run the facility that's there. And I think that I would like us to really focus in on how do we maintain and retain those senior officials who have been around for a long time, because they are extremely important to the value that we bring, and that these competitive things can happen. And it's not just about fairness, it's about keeping kids safe. I'm going to share with you a little story. That I was at a park board game one time, and sometimes there are qualified officials and there are newer officials, and newer officials need older or more senior officials to help support. There needs to be better training, because there is a lot that can happen in a game with parents, with coaches, with players. I was at Falwell Park. My wife was ejected from Falwell Park, but not because of the officiating or the calls, but because of the lack of calls. And it wasn't necessarily that official's fault, and this was years ago. Is because they were in a situation that they didn't know how to manage the game. And the game became unsafe for both teams. And she wasn't upset about the fact that one team was losing or one team was winning. It was the fact that the game was not being managed in a way that keeps kids and people safe. And I think that when we have people who are able to do that and do it well, we should value them, and we should pay them a little bit more, but also just value that they are providing a service to our community. Many of our officials live in the city. Many of our officials have opportunities to work other places around for more money. They choose to be here. Many of our officials are people of color. They are under contract, not labor union. So as we go into the budget season, and as you know, that I very much care about youth sports and recreation, that we don't forget about the people who make the games happen in a way that creates safety and fairness, but also love. That there are a lot of the people who have worked for this park system in a contract way for years who are mainstays in our kids' lives. And let's demonstrate that those people who keep coming back and keep serving our kids, let's demonstrate that we value that consistency. Thank you.
Vice President Kruger.
Thank you. Not you snitching out your wife, though, Billy. So, Sarah, feel free to put Billy in a headlock later.
It's a family joke, Vice President.
But since I missed the last meeting, there's a lot of things just some staff that I really want to shout out. The last couple of weeks have been extremely busy for me as a community leader, and I've had the opportunity to interact with a great deal of park board staff, frontline staff, just some really dynamic humans that I think add tremendous value to our system and where we're trying to go and what we're trying to do. And so I just want to shout them out. Ron over at PV, we hosted an event there. It was probably one of the hottest days of the year. And Paul Yeager, who supports Ron, I think is his direct supervisor. I know Paul from a different life, so we have a different relationship. And so I always appreciate him just supporting his team and his leadership style, but Ron was so great. We showed up at the park, and one of the basketball hoops had been either stolen or taken without anyone even noticing at PV Park. And Ron got on the phone, and before the tournament started that day, we had a basketball hoop back up. And I mean, we had over 10,000 people in the park, 0 incidents. When I say 0, I mean 0, none. I got to meet a couple new park police officers who I had not met because they didn't know what was going on. They didn't have time to stop by. They didn't need to stop by. We didn't have any police. We had our violence interrupters team. And then we had some of the street reach folks out there. And so it was just a great event. It was free. It was for community. And people just kept talking about how safe they felt and how welcome they felt. And so I think that that is really important. I know that Ron is fairly new. And we had Matt over at PV for a really long time. And he had a lot of really great relationships. And I think that Ron is building those same type of relationships in an authentic way with community that make community feel ownership and they feel pride, even in that little bit of space at PV. You see it attached to Hope Academy, so you think it's really big, but it's an intimate park. So the outside is huge, but the inside is small. And so huge shout out to Ron for just the hospitality to community, being flexible and kind of being on the go on a really busy day where most people kind of probably wanted to be inside. So, and then a huge shout out to the team over at Falwell Park. The following Saturday, I was there for another event put on by some young people. It was the younger staff there. It wasn't the full-time staff, and I can't remember their names, but there were some really dynamic young ladies who were really professional, given that they were really young, and a lot of the people participating were their peers. But they had great customer service. They were flexible. And they stood their ground. And it was really cool to see them kind of be leaders in a space with their friends. It hits a very interesting dynamic when you have teens sort of leading teens. And so it's always really cool to see our community come together and not have any issues or incidents, and people leave happy, they arrive happy. And so that was really awesome. And then huge shout out to Joy. I'm super biased because Joy is over at Corcoran Park, so I get to see Joy often or talk to her and just see how she's navigating the neighborhood. And she's just been a great addition from North Commons. And so Joy had posted this really cool picture of herself, Yvette from North Commons, and Newman. And these are really critical leaders in North Minneapolis. Like these folks, like people trust them. And I mean, a lot of young people trust them and families. And that's so important for our parks because right now we're in this space of where people have a distrust of the system, and not just parks, just in general. And so I just thought it was a really cool picture to know that those three were somewhere sitting together, just thinking about really cool ways that they can make a difference. Even though now Joy is across town in South Minneapolis, it's just such a big deal that we have these people who are committed to our community, and they go above and beyond the hours of the park. Like, people can find them and have access to them. And they're just really dynamic, and so we're really fortunate to have them on our team. And a huge shout out to, I think their supervisor is still Nicole Hernandez, maybe not Joy, but I know Nicole is new to the park board. So Nicole, great work. Keep building up your team. You're doing exactly what we need. And so that's all I got. Thank you, guys.
Thank you for that report. So we all know we need rain. I'm not sure, actually, today we still need it. But unfortunately, the Graco groundbreaking got rained out. So, I mean, we needed it, like I say. Anyway, so I just want to announce that it has been postponed to the 29th, so hope people can join us and everything. And as you know, I like to embarrass everybody. We missed you on your birthday, Commissioner Thompson, so we'd like to acknowledge you on that. And I understand that yesterday, Assistant Superintendent Barrick was kind enough to join us, for the school board meeting, but it was his birthday, so a happy birthday, and we'd like to acknowledge you. And of course, tomorrow, our vice president is going to be celebrating her day of birth. So, hey. And I have two other things that I at least would like to acknowledge. It has been really such a pleasure to work with the second oldest elected up here in making sure that these initiatives made. I mean, her seat on the BET has been so critical. I am just so humbled by the work that you did. And so I'd like to celebrate from one old broad to another old broad. And then also, in case nobody sees our superintendent for a few days and everything, tomorrow he is delivering his son, taking him off to college. So I'd like to congratulate Gabriel on his graduation and wish him the very, very best in the upcoming year. We look forward to hearing reports about it. So. We also are sad that you will be an empty nester. So on that, unless I hear any objections, I will adjourn then the full board and move this over to the Recreation Committee.
Thank you, President Forney. With that, I'll call the Recreation Committee to order. And Secretary Ringel, can you please call the roll?
Commissioner Thompson.
Here.
Commissioner Olson.
Here.
Commissioner Elper.
Here.
Vice Chair Crudup.
Here.
Chair Menz.
Here.
You have a quorum.
Can I take a motion to approve the agenda? Thank you. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Motion to approve the minutes from January 19th, 2023. Is that right, or is it July 19th? It's got to be July 19th. Can we make that July 19th? Motion to approve the minutes from July 19th, 2023.
I don't think so. It's probably January.
It's January. Sorry.
Does anybody know?
I'll move it, whichever one it is.
We had a Recreation Committee meeting on the 19th, so.
And sorry, my apology. Chair Menz, I'm just talking without you actually giving me the ability to talk. But it is possible that this is from January. We're still catching up on many minutes from throughout the year.
Thank you, Secretary Ringgold. Okay, then let's take a motion to approve the Recreation Committee minutes from January 19th, 2023.
Point of order. I'm not on this committee, but the attached minutes in our packet are from July 19th of 2023.
Thank you.
Good catch.
So, Secretary Ringgold, do we amend the agenda? We already approved it. I'm going to make a motion to suspend the rules.
Sure, that'll work.
Second. Do we need that?
All those in favor?
Aye.
Can we please amend the Recreation Committee minutes to say July 19th, 2023?
Point of order, I think you're amending the agenda to note the minute
Okay.
date being changed,
Can
rather
we
than
please
amending.
amend, a motion to amend the agenda to say July 19th instead of January 19th, 2023?
So moved.
Thanks. All those approved?
Aye.
Okay, now that we've rectified that clerical error, do we have to approve the agenda again? No, that's been approved. So
To do the minutes.
I'll take a motion to approve the minutes of the Recreation Committee from July 19th, 2023.
So moved.
Yes.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Great. We have two report items or study items on the agenda today. The first is an update on the history, use, revenue, and expenses at Fort Snelling Niemann Complex. I'd like to thank the Recreation Department and Assistant Superintendent Cal and Director Humphrey on putting this together. I know it's a big task and it's taken a while, but I think this is going to give us a lot of perspective on the history of that.
Chairman's.
My apology.
Yep.
We should approve the agenda as amended.
I will take a motion to approve the agenda as amended.
So moved.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Thank you. Director Humphrey, we are ready for you.
Thank you, Chairman. This is a overview of the Neiman Athletic Fields in the Fort Snelling Complex. Following that, we'll have one about the Northeast Ice Arena as well. I will go through this and take any questions at the end. So a little bit of history of the Fort Snelling Complex. The park board has been operating there since 1992 when we leased a 9-hole golf course. In 1999, we had leased approximately additional 50 acres and purchased 17 acres. Construction of softball, baseball, and soccer fields began in 2001, and they were open for play in 2003. We currently operate a 9-hole golf course and 16 fields on site. The Fred Wells Tennis Center is also on site through a lease agreement through us. It was from 2001. There is a building that the park board was not using that they sold to the Boy Scouts in 2007 that is currently under operation there. So everyone is aware of kind of how the budgeting works out there. The golf is operated out of the enterprise fund at that facility, but the fields are operated out of the general fund. So this is kind of an agency owner map, color-coded, that shows the kind of the red area and another shade of red that's the DNR where we lease. Park board owned land is in yellow, DNR land and National Park Service land. A little closer view that you can see where our leased area is. The yellow area to the northwest, and the northwest area kind of is land that the park board owns. And so breaking down information on the individual activities out there for golf, we do about 18 to 20,000 rounds of golf per year. We've averaged that since about 2020. Previous decade or so, it was a little lower. Golf had a boom when COVID hit, so we've been up a little bit there. We have a lease through 2029 with that golf course. Currently, the park board pays the DNR $56,000 a year plus 16% of all gross revenue taken at the golf course, making it a challenging site to be profitable at. We lose about $50,000 to $75,000 a year at that site in golf. If we didn't have an agreement with the DNR, we would be profitable, or a better agreement. There's a strong veterans presence there, strong women's leagues, and a lot of youth activity on that golf course. The clubhouse and the irrigation system are nearing the end of their useful life. We would probably need to do around $28,000 to $30,000 or 28 to 30,000 rounds of golf a year with our current agreement to be profitable on site. And as part of the lease, the park board is required to build a new clubhouse and restroom building at some point during the lease. We haven't done that yet. Some field information out there. We have 2 baseball, 3 softball, 11 soccer fields. All but 2 of the soccer fields have lights. It's a good location to play into the later evenings out there. There's not a lot of homes to be disturbed by lights. We pay 16% of our gross revenue to the DNR for adult athletics. We do not for youth, just for adults. We issue about 3,000 permits a year for that site. And our largest user groups are the MPRB, MIBA, which is Youth Traveling Baseball, Minneapolis Baseball, Minneapolis United Soccer, and then we have high schools from Minneapolis Public Schools. Minnehaha Academy uses a good amount of space out there, in 612 softball. We play hundreds of MPRB league games out there every year and use it for tournaments as well. And on the fields, we generate about $145,000 or so in revenue. This is from 2022, and about $350,000 in expenses to maintain it. Some of the challenges and opportunities at the site. Lack of restrooms and concessions is a challenge at that area. There's no permanent restroom building, and we don't have a concession facility on site. The field setup kind of lacks the infrastructure to host large tournaments the way that the fields and parking and setup, and combine that with the lack of restrooms and concessions. Scoreboards are nearing the end of their useful life, and they're going to need to be replaced. We have natural surface soccer fields, which are very nice, but they do require resting. So we always have a couple of large fields out of service, so we're never at 100% capacity use there because of the resting of the fields. And one of the other challenges out there is there's multiple agencies on site. So there's the Park Service, Department of Veterans Affairs, State Historic Preservation Office, the DNR, and the Park Board. Trying to get anything done, built, altered, changed out there can be a lot of red tape to go through, and a lot of different agencies have to agree on things to have anything happen out there. There is a new veteran housing development. I don't know if any of you have seen this, but it's really nice. They redid the officers' row and a lot of the structures behind there, so now there's housing for veterans out there. There are people that are out there now, and it's really wonderful, and it does open up the door to some other possibilities of programming and service out at that site. And a note on if you're looking at changing the funds, moving this into the potentially in the enterprise fund from the general fund. The enterprise fund would have to assume about $200,000 a year in operating costs that we currently have a shortfall on while it's in the general fund. And the other issue would be, or challenge might be, the improvements to the facility. There hasn't been any large-scale capital investments at that site, I believe, since 2015. So we're going on 8-9 years where there are going to have to be updates and upgrades made to those facilities at some point. And that would have to go into the general fund CIP for that to be supported. And with that, I'll take any questions that you may have on anything that was presented today.
I'll go with Commissioner Olson.
Does the lease specify that it has to be a golf course that those 16% revenue comes from, or just whatever we do there, if we generate revenue, they get 16%?
Mr. Schroeder might be a better, Chairman, Commissioner Olson, Mr. Schroeder might know more. My understanding is that we have to provide recreational opportunities on site, and we do have some leeway on what exactly we offer there.
Okay. Yeah, just because, I do think this is something that could be ripe for a different type of enterprise, something maybe more innovative, something that we think might actually generate profit or revenue, especially now that we're reaching the end of the lifespan on various irrigation things. I would be really interested to look at alternatives.
Commissioner Thompson.
Thank you so much, Chairman. Can we look at that map again of all the patchwork quilt of jurisdictions? Yeah, that. So is the lease just with the DNR, or is it with a bunch of agencies? I know this as well as maybe anybody could, this area.
Chairman, Commissioner Thompson, I believe our lease is only with the DNR.
Okay. I'm so curious about the details of this lease. Is there a way that we could get a copy of that? Is it accessible to us to see the ins and outs, even what Commissioner Olson was talking about? I'm so curious. As a child of the city who went to Minneapolis Academy, I've been curious about this my entire adult life, because I'm like, how did that happen? Who owns what? What is going on over there? And hearing this is very interesting, especially as we put it in the enterprise fund versus the general fund, and the specifics as to why it makes a lot of sense operationally. I'm just curious if that's something that is worth looking into, maybe adapting changes in the future. You were talking about some of the assets we need to build something to that capacity. Is that available to us?
Chair Mentz, Commissioner Thompson, I'm assuming we can furnish you with all that information, yes.
I would love that. Thank you so much. I don't know that I have any other questions. I just thank you for putting this together. This is very, very informative, and thanks.
Commissioner Alper.
Thanks. I might have missed this because I had to pop out to the bathroom. When does the lease with the DNR expire or come up for renewal?
Chair Mentz, Commissioner Alper, our lease for the golf course polo grounds area, I believe, is up in 2029.
Okay. Do we have demographics of Neiman users? You mentioned some different leagues, but I'm just curious. Do we have that information?
Chair Mentz, Commissioner Alper, I would have to check on that. I don't know that off the top of my head. I know that our golf software does track some things, but it doesn't track everything. And I would check with our league directors and permit manager on that and see if we did have that, but I'm not sure off the top of my head.
Okay, that's something I'm curious about. And then last but not least, what city is Neiman located in?
None.
To whose committee is that? I don't know. I'll just answer the question. It's unincorporated territory of Hennepin County.
Okay. But not technically in Minneapolis?
It's not in any city.
Not in any city. So, correct. Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Thanks. I'd also be really interested to see the lease from the DNR, and wondering, I'm a little bit concerned about the fact that we might have to build a clubhouse, or like how willing do you think, maybe you don't know this, Director Humphrey, that the DNR would be willing to relook at that lease? And I also find it interesting and that the DNR doesn't charge us the revenue or the tax or whatever they want to call it, their commission, for youth activities there. And correct me if I'm wrong, but this is a site where we have maintenance on site. So this is a place where we actually have maintenance people who are on the site and do the maintenance at the facility. Is that correct?
Chairman, yes, we have maintenance staff to maintain the fields, and then we also have golf staff on site as well.
And the maintenance staff to maintain the fields, do they solely work there, or do they have other places that they might go to maintain fields?
Chairman, I would probably defer to Assistant Superintendent Barrick if he's there, or I would have to check with Director Evenson on that.
Okay.
I could make a speculative guess, but I'm not 100% sure what they do with all of their time. The bulk of it is at Neiman Complex.
Okay. It would be great to have that copy of that lease, and maybe we can put it in the communications on the full board agenda at some point, President Forney, just to have it so that we can review it, not as a study item again. The reason I asked the Recreation Department to put this on the agenda is Neiman is a very unique space. And I mean, I didn't even know it wasn't a city in the city. But it is a very valuable piece of land for certain athletic endeavors. We currently use a lot of it for MPRB games, but it's not necessarily the most convenient place for people to get. So my purpose in putting this out to the board is that right now we lose money on it. Maybe we don't have to, but maybe we have to sacrifice a little bit of like almost forcing teams to go out to this facility, which is great. They have good fields. They're pretty good fields. But I think that it might be a place where it might be more useful as more of a regional asset for revenue generation. Then I'm not saying we should exclude the MPRB teams from going out there, but I don't know if we have to go out there every week, because I don't think that the community necessarily wants that. Whereas we could be, reworking this space to be more amenable for those larger scale tournaments, or inviting other communities in to put their money into our park system. Because if we have tournaments come through, or we have that type of facilitation, we're getting revenue from other places if we can figure out how to pass that along. We don't want to exclude people from using our fields who are in our programming, but I also think we want to be really smart about when we use the facilities that could generate revenue coming from even outside of the city to the parks, and when we can't. And this is a place where we could possibly do that. Vice President Crudup.
Quick question, Director Humphries. I know you mentioned soccer, baseball. Do we have football over there?
Chair Mentz, Vice President Crudup, we currently do not host football games on the fields there. The open fields are just for soccer.
Okay, is there a reason why we don't do, I know we have a small football program right now in our parks, but I'm thinking about as things kind of grow, hopefully grow, enrollment grows, people come back to our park system. It's such a beautiful place, and I know that it's kind of off the beaten path, which makes it even more exciting for young people to have the opportunity to play there. Is that something that we can explore in the future?
Chairman, Vice President Crudup, I can look and see what the history is with us in football on that site and see what the possibilities are. I do believe that there's probably some issues with how bad it tears up the turf, but I can look into that and get back to you on it.
Yeah, I would be really curious about that, and I hear the turf piece, but I'm also thinking about kind of that K-8 in compares to high school teenage bodies for soccer, the wear and tear being very similar, but I'll wait for you to get back. Thank you.
One last question around the revenue loss at the space. So, I mean, I don't think we're advocating one or the other to move, but if we're losing money at the golf course and we're losing money at the fields, I mean, is there any way for us? Have we been creatively thinking about how we might be able to gain revenue at those spots?
Chair Mentz, I think that we would be in favor of any ideas to gain revenue. I think golf has increased its rounds there, and our revenue numbers are better. It's a challenging situation though when you're paying 16% of your gross revenue into the DNR plus a $57,000, $56,000 annual payment. I think I'd mentioned earlier, if we just ran that golf course, we could run it profitably. But the deal that we have the DNR is eating into any kind of profits that we can make. I think the 9-hole course is a bit of a challenge. This fall right now we're regrassing 5 holes on that course. So hopefully the playability will be a little better. But we do have challenges with the infrastructure there as well. Our maintenance buildings are in pretty rough shape. The irrigation system is on its last legs, so there is some challenges there as well. And when we purchased or leased this facility in 1992, golf was probably doing 30,000 to 35,000 rounds a year out at that site, and that continued for probably 10 to 12 years until 2005, 6, 7, somewhere around there when they started going down. At that point, it was profitable, and if we could get to a 28 to 30,000 round a year, we would be able to run at their profit. But there's significant challenges, but we'd be open to any ideas of getting more people out there, and hopefully this regrassing does some of it. And also we're examining rates for next year. With the amount of play that we've had right now, we're probably in a position where rates could be increased next year. Is this the least profitable golf course that we have in our system? Chair Mentz, yeah, on an individual basis, Fort Snelling would be the least profitable golf course in the system.
Are the rest of the golf courses in the positive right now with the new increase in golf?
Chair Mentz, I haven't seen the exact budget numbers, but I'd venture to guess that every one of our 18-hole golf courses is profitable right now.
So, so I'd like the board to really kind of, we put this before you. Commissioner Olson, go ahead. Just to kind of think about the idea of what would be the implications of closing this golf course and using it for different recreational facilities that match sort of what's going on in that space already. So I don't want to beat around the bush. I think that that's an option that we should be exploring.
Yeah, well, so I had a question on a different thing, but just kind of to piggyback off of that. Yeah, I think I would be completely, I think because it is kind of an out-of-way space, it is something where we can afford and have to look at something that's incredibly unique and incredibly something you can't really replicate because it is kind of off the beaten path and folks would have to go there for a specific reason. And Commissioner Bene wrote velodrome on a piece of paper, and you know, that could be actually something that could be very unique and something that, you know, it's right next to the airport, that's something, it's right next to the Blue Line. But my question was actually on, so you mentioned that there's veterans housing. Was that on the DNR land that's not being leased, or was that on our land or our yellow area? Do you know where that was?
Just Chairman, Commissioner Olson, if you look at the map that's up right now on the kind of reddish area on the southeastern, it would be east or southeast of where the baseball, soccer fields, and golf course is. That's where the housing redevelopment is done, that area of the park.
So, you know, kind of one, because it is kind of such a tough recreational area to put up, and kind of a bit of a dubious asset, I do want to at least bring up and put into people's heads, you know, we had folks from our native community who are looking at East Phillips, right, for a spot to kind of help alleviate the crisis that their community is going through. And also in those conversations that I've had with, you know, community leaders there, Snelling has kind of come up. And I know that, you know, the lease in DNR, and you said there's a lot of different difficulties, but kind of thinking of radical ideas, thinking of ways to benefit our communities in, you know, an area that is maybe not exactly ideal for traditional recreational activities. I would just kind of like to put that nugget into people's heads that this could be a spot where maybe we deviate a little bit from typical park board mission to help the overall community, and it might be something that we could think of. So just putting that thought out there that I had. Thanks.
I'm going to go to Commissioner Musich first 'cause for her first time, and I know that she's not on the committee, but then I'll get to you, Commissioner Alper. Oh, I'm sorry. I did not see legal counsel.
Maybe I could just jump in quickly since the map is up. This was quite an interesting acquisition. If you looked at the underlying fee on this property, it actually is the United States government. We lease it from the Department of Natural Resources, but they really only have it contingent upon a grant from the U.S. Army. And so it is true we have a 30-year lease. It runs to 2029. But in order to get that lease, we actually had to get the legislature to approve it. And it's possible for the board to consider changes to it, but it would be a fairly elaborate effort to do so. There's a great history there because was Fort Snelling, as a question was raised, this is an unincorporated part of Hennepin County. It literally is the first place, if you cross the road and look at the green triangular area or the red area, you'll see the reconstructed Fort Snelling that was there. It was we're going back to Snelling. And the engineers from the Army Corps that came up here and quote unquote founded it or whatever, started to put down markers for the United States government. This whole complex was a military base up until, you know, World War II. And so there's history with the State Historical Society. We were in litigation on this matter to even establish the fields that were there. That was done after a long court case. The Friends of Fort Snelling sued us and didn't want the the soccer fields there. The DNR consented to transfer the golf course to us, but in essence, they are getting a pretty substantial payment that they don't reinvest a single penny into the area. They put it into their own DNR funds when they're always looking for money. So getting them to renegotiate a quite favorable lease would be difficult. And just so the board knows, your predecessor spent many hours and a lot of time and legal fees and this whole thing to get to where you're at. So it would be nice to reimagine it, and I'm sure Mr. Schroeder and the planning department are very good at that, about looking at uses. But if you go down that avenue, it ultimately could take an act of the legislature and getting the Department of Natural Resources, which is much more strapped for cash, or at least they say they are, than we are, to ask them to renegotiate, a pretty good lease that in time has, it's 6 years to run, but believe me, in terms of government work, 6 years to run. I think it's good the board's looking at it. The bigger question might be, what do you want to do with this property in 6 years? Do you want to renew the lease or not? And if so, how would you deal with it?
Thanks, Councilor Rice. Commissioner Musich.
Thank you, Chairman. I'm not on this committee, so I appreciate being given an opportunity to speak. Earlier, you had noted that the VA housing was in the red section adjacent to the leased area, and it's actually adjacent to the yellow triangle that we used to have as a tree processing site. That's where the VA housing is, and that's part of why we had to shut down the tree processing site, is because it was so close to that housing. I'm interested in understanding, and perhaps Assistant Superintendent Schroeder could speak to this, but we for many years were engaged in a study with the DNR around how we could reimagine some of this land as a place to expose people to recreational opportunities that would prepare them to be able to take advantage of state park amenities like ice climbing, mountain biking. I forget what the other things were, but we had a huge list of things that we were exploring with them because we wanted to provide people that live in Minneapolis that maybe don't get out to state parks because they don't understand how to use them or how to take advantage of the opportunities there, to expose people to the skills that they would need to feel confident when they got to a state park and use those spaces. So if you could maybe help us understand what the status of the intergovernmental study was, and when we might have some results from that, and how that could help inform what the potential future use of the site would be, because I know part of the reason we entered into that was that we didn't really see this being we saw this being a very expensive lease to both operate and maintain, and that perhaps it wasn't the best long-term solution for either of our agencies for us to continue to operate it as is or even independently. There might be an opportunity for partnership here versus us leasing it. So if you could maybe bring us up to speed on where that's at and correct any misremembering I might have just shared with my colleagues, that'd be great.
Chairman, Commissioner Misich, let me just describe one thing first. The area in the red is actually housing being developed by a company called Dominium. So it's a privately developed thing, and you're correct, the area that's next to the yellow was developed as veterans housing. Under a previous superintendent and a previous director of the Department of Natural Resources, or Commissioner of Natural Resources, or Assistant Commissioner Erica Rivers, there was an effort to develop what would be called a skills and adventure center. It was essentially a place where people could be exposed to outdoor experiences in a safe way, particularly focusing on those skills that inner city folks wouldn't normally have. We were finding that even skills like camping skills or fishing skills were not, they're not robustly practiced in inner city, by some inner city folks, and that this would provide an opportunity to expose them safely to that, and then essentially graduate to Fort Snelling State Park, which lies just below the bluff, and then allow them to get out to other regional parks or state parks to keep expanding their skills. And that could relate to features like mountain biking, any number of outdoor sports. And it would the notion would be that it would be jointly programmed by park board staff and by through the DNR, through the rangers, and mostly through a program they have called I Can. It's like I Can Fish, I Can Camp, those kinds of activities. So we, through a cooperative agreement, developed a concept plan. We could share that concept plan with the board. It's really kind of lost some momentum with the changes in leadership at the DNR, but they still have talked about it. One thing that I will tell you, in that process, it was very clear that they do not want to let us out of the lease before 2029, and any change would be predicated on having some kind of a joint activity happening there, but probably not until after 2029.
Thank you for that context. I think it would be very, very beneficial for the board to see the Skills and Adventure Center concept. I know previous boards that had talked about it were very excited about this potential for an underutilized space so close to the urban core. So, yeah, thanks.
Commissioner Alper, sorry for the delay.
Oh, no problem. Thanks for the great discussion. I'm really glad we're bringing this forward tonight. If you asked me tonight about renewing the lease, I would say no, quite frankly, based on what I'm hearing today. I heard about those programs. I can camp, I can fish, and they're amazing. I think they sound really great, and I'd love to see something like that happen. You know, we talked about a curriculum, bringing kids to the river, you know, thinking about more of our connection between our urban core and our regional assets or statewide assets. But it doesn't sound like this in its current form is the place for it. Frankly, what really gets to me is that we should not be losing money outside of Minneapolis. And unlike some other parks that we operate outside of the jurisdictional boundaries, you can at least walk there. There's no walking to Neiman Complex. You cannot, it's not within a 10-minute walk shed of where any Minneapolis resident lives. It sounds like an unfavorable lease. You know, I mentioned the challenging access issues. It seems like it has some questionable benefits in some areas, and I just really think we should be asking ourselves, what is the benefit that we receive, our residents, the people who live here, who help pay for this, or who could be benefiting if this were removed from the system, from the increase, you know, not having that lost revenue. What's the business reason for keeping this? So I guess that's where I'm at, hearing from everything tonight.
Thanks, Director Humphrey, for bringing this forward. Just to respond to that really quickly, Commissioner Alper, there's a huge benefit for the fields. They are very, there's a scarcity of fields actually, but we're finding in the TAC, and this space is one of those places where we can guarantee quality fields that are maintained and the maintenance. And I think that looking at that and how we could build the revenue of those fields could make it a lot more profitable. So there is a lot of benefit there, but I am questioning the benefit of an additional public golf course next to the airport that we already have a few other really wonderful public golf courses in this city.
And if I may respond to you, Chairman, just to say that I think that's really what I was remarking on, that we have the least profitable golf course in our system located in Narnia, outside of the boundary of Minneapolis.
Thank you for that discussion. We're going to go on to the next item. I think we get, oh, there you go, Superintendent, sorry.
Thank you. I was a little bit delayed on this. Thank you, Co-Chair Menz. I just wanted to mention the question about, in particular, Neiman Field. Neiman Field was under our athletic facility permit policy that the board had adopted, specifically that field would be used for its intended use as it was designed. So the field is being used for its intended use, which is soccer and tournament frisbee, those kind of things. That, again, was a board-adopted policy on the building of that particular field. The question that came, I can even refer back to Jack Barth, who does a lot of the scheduling and the work there too, around that, has put out a very detailed data set around the number of youth and teams that practice out of there and use that field, which is incredibly diverse. And that we do have that information, which kind of breaks down the diversity of that population that's in there using that field, and it is very diverse. As far as football is concerned, we have fields that we can use anywhere in our particular park system, or schools that use football fields throughout our park system, whether it's schools or our own particular fields. So if it's a question of folks wanting to use Neiman Field to play football, again, when we responded to that concern, we then said again, the field was designed for its intended use, which then reflects the use and the build of that particular field. So I just want to be clear about the fact that it's not as if we are denying folks, but we are just following the policy and what the intended use of the field was by our facility permit use. And that we do have fields and access to football fields across our entire park system, along with schools and our own park particular assets. Thank you.
Thanks. And to piggyback, and just as we're kind of giving context to this, I've often wondered, and I don't know, and as the fields TAC kind of looks at this, there's 3 fields out there that are youth baseball fields that if the fences were moved in 15 to 20 feet would also be youth softball or high school softball fields. So we would be sacrificing one age group of baseball players that would not have fields for that. But those are the types of solutions that we kind of need to, I guess, examine. But we can go on to the Northeast. Do we have another one? Oh, now we got Vice President Crudup. I need dings or something. My eyes are going. Secretary Ringgold.
Nope.
No, Council Rice. Secretary Ringgold.
Chair Menz and committee members, I think one thing I want to just draw a line to, because there's so much really good thinking happening on this property right now, and while there's kind of a shared lease component to it, part of this conversation was about general fund versus enterprise fund, and just to draw the attention to that the golf course there currently sits in the enterprise fund, whereas the fields sit in the general fund. So as you continue to muse and kind of think about what this might be, just know that you're actually talking about a space that has assets in both of those funds. Just wanted to bring that to attention.
Vice President Crudup.
Oh, just really quickly, thanks, Al, for that history. And I think the great thing about a board adopted policy is that this board can adopt a new one that fits the demand of community, just to put that out there.
In response to Vice President Crudup's request and wondering about football, I wonder if the Recreation Department or staff could maybe we could do a review of the De La Salle football field, because I think that one is that we do have access to that, but we don't really understand how. So maybe that would be something for the future on the Recreation Committee also. Go ahead. Did we get you again? Go ahead, Larry.
Yes, you do. The next study item is a informational report on the status of Northeast Ice Arena, and I'll go through kind of the same thing that we did for Neiman and Fort Snelling. So a little bit of history. This building was constructed in 1997 by Edison Youth Hockey for $2.2 million. They had a large pull tab, charitable gambling revenue, along with, I believe, a loan from the state and some other monies to construct it. It was purchased by the Minneapolis Park Board in 2006. Edison was in default on their loan, Edison Youth Hockey was, for about $750,000, and renamed Northeast Ice Arena shortly after. At the time of the purchase in 2006, it was inspected and widely estimated that the facility had about 15 years of useful life left in the building, which would have brought us to about 2021. Also, the Minnesota Wild did donate a dryland training center there in 2022. We have a very nice amenity there that is used by a lot of youth from our city. So the use of the arena, it's primarily a rental facility. It's in the enterprise fund, and it serves MPRB Youth Hockey, Storm Hockey, Titans Youth Hockey. Minneapolis Public High Schools MPS uses it for a practice site. We have a lot of private rentals. We do turf rentals March through August. There's ice in the building from September through the end of February, the first week of March, depending on schedules. We have dryland training. And in 2022, we rented 910 hours of ice time and 204 hours of turf rentals. We had about $202,000 in revenue and about $360,000 in expenses at that facility. So structural components of the building, there was a study just done in July of 2023 by Bush Architects. Some of the findings they had, that there's not proper insulation for energy code standards in that building. Part of the reason why it's really hard for us to keep ice in there throughout the year. The building gets so hot, and it's just insulated really poorly. There's a lack of sufficient restrooms for running the building at capacity. There are restrooms upstairs and downstairs, but the amount of facilities in the building isn't adequate for full capacity loads of the building. There's some small structural issues, nothing that was majorly alarming for the consultant, but there are some cracks forming in some of the walls in the building. The overall assessment, though, is that the building is in need of updates and some rehabilitation. Also, the roof is nearing the end of its anticipated lifespan. In 2019, the B32 engineering group did a study on the ice systems, meaning what it keeps the ice cold, the ice rink, all of that good stuff. The refrigeration system was deemed reaching its end of its life cycle in 2019 when it was evaluated. The report recommended replacement or updating of the refrigeration system with cost estimates of about $725 to $1.2 million. The current system they have uses R22 refrigerant. I don't know if many of you are familiar with that. It's no longer manufactured. It's no longer shipped into the U.S. You can still buy it. There are still some systems that use it, but it's not a modern like ammonia system or anything like we have at Parade Ice Garden. We do have leaking glycol on the floor. It's an ongoing issue that we deal with yearly, and eventually the floor will probably have to be torn up to get the leaks fixed permanently. The hockey boards are in need of replacement. If you go in there, you can see, especially during the summer when it gets warm out and they expand, you get a little bit of a wavy look with some of the hockey boards there. They get a little bit better in the winter when it gets colder and they shrink a little bit. And the overall assessment from the ice systems was that the system is in need of updates and rehab. Also in 2019, they did an assessment of the mechanical systems of the building. The largest thing that they found individually was the dehumidification system was at the end of its lifespan. It's about a $300,000 replacement cost. It's fairly expensive. The unit arena heaters, which heat the arena themselves, and the Zamboni room were at the end of their lifespan. The refrigeration room ventilation system is also at the end of its lifespan. This is from 2019. There are some other minor replacement upgrades were needed. Since 2019, we have replaced some systems in the buildings, done some water heaters, a couple other things in that building. But just about everything that's original in that building is needed to be replaced at this time. So some of the challenges and opportunities with the site, the original systems are at the end of their, lifespan. And it's just a fact that things are just wearing out in the building. The building construction really makes it challenging to maintain ice during the summer months. Anything past about mid to late April is really challenging to keep ice in. There's no showers in the facility, and like I said, the lack of restrooms can be a challenge. But I think there is potential for alternate use as well. I do think that we could probably look at adult pickleball if we could get a floor surface in there, which would be great in the spring. Maybe some trade shows, some adult athletics, or other programming in that facility as well. So with that, and also talking about changing the funds. If this was something that was interested in going into the general fund outside of where it's currently in the enterprise fund, the general fund would need to increase its net budget by about $160,000 a year. The revenue generated for the site could change if this went to the general fund and we have other objectives where we're offering, free ice time for the MPRB hockey teams or, community free skating, so we're not renting out as much ice. The amount of revenue generated in this facility most likely would decrease if it was in the general fund. And then the capital improvements would need to take on almost $2 million in needed repairs for this facility. So there'd be impacts similar to Neiman going into the enterprise fund, this going into the general fund. There would be impacts either way. And I will take any questions that you have.
Commissioner Olson.
Yeah, so you said it's primarily rental. Do we have any idea of like demographics of use? Is it folks mostly in Minneapolis who are using this and renting it, and organizations within the city, or is it kind of folks from outside?
Chair Mentz, Commissioner Olson, primarily Minneapolis. Minneapolis Storm Hockey, Titans Youth Hockey, MPRB Youth Hockey, and then Minneapolis High Schools. There are some groups that from outside, but this facility, the majority of the rentals are from Minneapolis programs.
And if we were to stop making ice here for whatever reason, do we think there would be enough capacity in the rest of the system to make up for the loss of capacity here, or?
Chair Mentz, Commissioner Olson, prime time, we wouldn't have capacity to add more. What we have would, if it wasn't there, to be able to maintain our current service level, we would need to find another sheet of ice. Minnehaha Academy recently closed their rink this year, so that will have an impact. We're already feeling a little bit of the impact on requests for ice. Our biggest challenge, though, is it's not the April, May, June, July. It's October through February from 4:30 p.m. to 10 p.m. Those are the prime times where all the youth groups want ice, the high schools want ice. That's the time where we really need another sheet of ice.
Okay. And do you think the lack of revenue, the unprofitability of it, is the quality of the ice in the arena? Does that eat into that, do we think? Do we think that if we were to invest in this system that we would be able to, that it would become a desirable location, so we would get more revenue generation? Is there any kind of idea of that, of a return on an investment into this arena?
Chair Mentz, Commissioner Olson, I would venture to say that the ice quality has never been a major issue there. The biggest challenge there is it's a single sheet facility that holds ice for 6 months a year. If we were able to hold ice there for 12 months a year, the rate for renting ice is a lot higher than turf, and the rentals per hours per week are generally higher for renting ice than it is for renting turf. It is a challenge to be profitable on a single rink facility. If you notice, most cities that have hockey rinks have multiple sheets of ice in a single location rather than a single sheet of ice. And most of the arenas right now that are single sheets were built in the 90s or 80s or 70s. And most arenas built post 1995, 2000 are all multiple sheet facilities.
Okay, so this sort of arena is kind of becoming a bit obsolete, would you kind of say, in throughout the metro area?
Chair Mentz, Commissioner Olson, I would say that I don't know of any new facilities that are being built with a single sheet of ice. No.
Thanks.
I'm not seeing any more lights. I'm learning to scan better. So, Commissioner Olson, to respond to yours, I think that Director Humphrey is understating the need for ice during those high priority times. We've lost Victory over the past 5 years, and now Minnehaha, and there is a high need for ice. However, I think that the last board possibly missed an opportunity to expand this site, because now there's housing around. The question that I have is, do we know the value of that land? Because if you've never been to Northeast Ice Arena, it is right on Central Avenue, which is in huge development right now, and the ice arena is honestly a little bit out of place. I mean, I love it right there, but I'm wondering, is it more financially feasible to look at how much that land is currently worth and then build a new two-sheet ice facility? Is that something that the board can do, or is that something that we can examine?
Chair Mentz, I would probably defer to maybe Assistant Superintendent Schroeder on that land value. I don't know what that is.
Chair Mentz, we could do one of two things. We could compare it to the land value for surrounding properties to get a basic understanding. If we wanted to get a more specific understanding of the value, we'd probably go through an appraisal process, which we do on properties often.
Have we ever received any inquiries on that property that we know of?
We've received, in my time here, I know of one specific, and it was from one of the building trades unions who wanted to buy that building and build a new building on that site.
Did they ever give us a number?
No.
No.
The only other thing that I know, when the streetcar was being planned, I don't know if it was the City of Minneapolis or Metropolitan Council, identified this as a potential site for a streetcar maintenance facility.
Thanks. Commissioner Thompson.
Thank you so much, Chairmans. I, having pretty decent knowledge of two other arenas that have been mentioned here, I know that Victory was constantly in use, but then the school board, of course, deemed that the cost of fixing it to where the cooling system was online environmentally was just a bridge too far. Very, very similar situation at Minnehaha, where they just, I know for a fact that they were making always good money on ice rentals until it became prohibitive with that cooling. Are we at that tipping point with Northeast Arena in terms of, you said it's the 2019 is when it's kind of like we're running on fumes, both literally and figuratively, for the system. But there's a lot of, like, what would the tipping point look like for closure and or just being like, we have to fix this? Obviously, these other boards and these different organizations chose one way. I'm just curious where we are.
Chairman, Commissioner Thompson, I think we're approaching a tipping point. The arena still runs. Now, every September when we fill it with water and turn the cooling system on, we cross the fingers and we hope that everything works okay. The biggest thing is the unknown. So 3 weeks from now, when we fire everything up and put ice back in, there may be a catastrophic failure. And that's something, if it happens, then we have to deal with that when it crosses. Last year, we had one issue with one spot of ice where we had some leaking glycol. We ended up doing some minor repairs, and it was fixed for the year. And like I said, we were able to manage through. So until, I guess, we have a catastrophic failure at the site, it's still operable. When we get to the point, it's kind of like when you have an old car and you get to a point where you're putting $1,000 a month into your car and suddenly you decide it's time to buy a new one. I don't know if we're at that point yet. We do put a good amount of money into repairs and maintenance at that facility. And I know that, we've had discussions as staff on, how much can we really afford to put in there. But we haven't had a catastrophic failure. We've had a water heater go out, we've had glycol leaks and some other things, but in my opinion, I don't think we're at a catastrophic failure yet, but we are approaching somewhere where something will fail here eventually.
Did I write it down correctly from the presentation that it would be $2 million to update the cooling system, or would it be more than that? Did I grab the wrong number?
Chairman, Commissioner Thompson, the cooling system update estimate was about $750 to $1.2 million.
Okay.
And the reason for the variance in that is there's 3 or 4 different options that you could do.
Mm-hmm.
I'd say one's kind of the, slightly more bare bones, where one's slightly more upper end.
Mm-hmm.
So that goes with the variance in there. Now, redoing the cooling system also entails, ripping up the floor, putting a new floor in, and at that point, if you're ripping the floor up, there is no reason to put the boards in there now. So if you do that, you need to put new boards in as well. So some of that stuff can snowball. The $2 million figure was everything. The mechanical systems, the dehumidifiers, the heaters, there's a garage door in the back that's going bad, but about everything in there would be about $2 million.
If we had that, like as my father would say, the Cadillac of systems, right, and we're confident that it's going to work, would Northeast or any ice facility, do you, from your experience, perceive it being rented out all the time? Like even in the summer months, what is the capacity?
Chairman, Commissioner Thompson, parade's rented out every day during the summer. There are 4th of July, it's not rented out. It's not going to be rented out Labor Day or the day before because we're doing some repairs to the system there, but it's rented out every day. If we had ice every day, it would be rented out nearly every day. It wouldn't be rented out 16 hours a day every day during the summer, but it would be rented out for a portion of it for every day during the summer.
Yeah, that's what I thought. Thank you so much.
Commissioner Musich.
Chairmans, for the renovations that are being proposed, should we decide to go down that path, does that include the envelope improvements that would be necessary to allow the facility to operate in a more efficient manner and year-round? Or is that only replacing the pieces that are needed to have ice, and we still have all the same problems that we have now around a building that's leaking and can't maintain ice throughout the summer season?
Chair Mentz, Commissioner Musich, the only thing that is not included in that 2 million, because I don't have a number for it, is the roof and how bad it ends up being. But that would include being able to have the facility run ice year-round, improving the insulation, everything else like that. But it does not include the roof. Was not able to get a price on a roof, and I'm not 100% sure what kind of condition that's in.
Okay, that's good to know. I have a question for Council Rice then. It sounds to me as if the chair is proposing we potentially sell this property and use the proceeds to buy a new property and build out something with more ice. Is I think what he's talking about potentially. Do the rules around land sales apply to buildings? So would we require getting buy-in from a judge that this is no longer necessary for park use in order to sell it?
Let's see, Mr. Chair, Commissioner Musich, the answer is yes. I mean, and I didn't hear the chair say to do you speculating or imagining what's possible. But yes, hypothetically, if the board were to decide to sell the land and the building, it would take 2/3, 6 votes. We'd have to go seek approval from a district court for the sale and go through whatever else you do with the sale of land.
Yeah, but we'd have to demonstrate it can't be used as a park any longer.
Yes, or not needed as a park. So you probably would say we have another facility, or we will have another facility at point B, and this is point A, and that would be the argument.
I see. I mean, it sounds to me like a tough pitch, but also I'm finding it hard to understand why we'd continue to throw money at a building that is not meeting the needs of the system. So thank you for that additional information. I appreciate it.
Thanks, and thank you, Council Rice. I was not speculating that I was speculating that we could do, I'm looking for creative solutions, and there would only be that if we were to have additional ice as a result of selling that property, not to sell it without getting additional ice for the park. I did want to be fully transparent, and that's why I put these items before the Recreation Committee, because on the budget, we do see these items losing money. And I would challenge to make sure that we understand that there is a very big benefit to Northeast Ice Arena. There is a very big benefit to the fields that are happening, because the youth and young people are using them constantly. And if we had ice year-round at Northeast Ice Arena, it would be filled, and it would increase opportunities for young people and for our park programming as well. My last question, does that site, or would that site, possibly be able to host 2 sheets of ice?
Chair Mentz, I am not a landscape architect, so I don't know what the exact measurements of everything would be. My initial guess would be that we would have a challenge with parking, adding another site or another rink at that site.
But even maybe a mini rink. Okay, all right. Thank you very much. That was very informative. Board, I appreciate you going through this. With that, I will call, if there's no other lights, I'll call that adjourned. Thank you very much.
Okay, the time being now 7:51, I will call to order the Administration and Finance Committee. Can the Secretary please call the roll?
Commissioner Musich.
Present.
Commissioner Menz.
Present.
Vice President Crudup.
Here.
Co-Chair Schaefer.
Here.
Co-Chair Thompson.
Here.
You have a quorum.
Thank you so much. I understand we would like to potentially amend the agenda. I was curious if Co-Chair Schaefer has something she wants to add.
I would first move the agenda.
Yes. Oh, that probably, thank you for that point of order. Could someone please move the agenda?
I will move the agenda.
Thank you. All those in favor of the agenda as moved?
I would like to then request that we amend the agenda to include the resolution that was sent to us yesterday or the day before. Resolution directing staff to require Board of Commissioner approval for any action relating to an encroachment immediately adjacent to water bodies, including an action to issue a construction permit, beginning on the date following approval of this resolution and extending for a period of not more than 365 days.
All those in favor of adding that to the agenda, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, we will move forward with the agenda as amended and put Co-Chair Schaefer's resolution at the end. Okay.
So we now need to take a vote.
Oh,
on the agenda as amended.
I thought we just did. Sorry, I made that mistake.
Voted on the amendment.
Now we will vote on the agenda as amended. Thank you very much, Commissioner Musich. All those in favor of the amended agenda, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? That motion carries. Perfect. Would someone like to move the minutes for me?
I'll move the minutes of July 6th, 2022 and August 2nd, 2023.
Fantastic. All those in favor of those minutes being approved, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Oh, that carries. Okay, let's get to the action. Someone like to move our first resolution?
I will move Resolution 2023-157, resolution approving professional services agreement with McMonigle Architects, LLC for architectural services at Theodore Wirth Home and Administration Building, a National Register of Historic Places structure located in Lindale Farmstead Park in the amount of $47,000.
Does anyone have any questions on this? Yes, Commissioner Musich.
Thank you. I don't actually have questions. I do appreciate you coming so swiftly to be able to answer them. Assistant Superintendent Schroeder. I just wanted to thank everyone for finally getting us to a place where we can actually start making some improvements to the house. It's been in really tough shape for a long time, and our superintendent lives there with his family, and many woodland visitors occasionally in the attic, which I'm sure is not awesome. So I'm thrilled to see that we're at a place where we can move forward with making some of these improvements. It's really awesome to see. So thanks everybody for making this happen.
Absolutely, I concur. Seeing no lights. All those in favor of Resolution 2023-157, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? That motion carries. On to the next one.
I'll move Resolution 2023-152. It's a resolution approving lease agreement with Mark McNally, leasing commercial space at 3104 Pacific Street North, Unit 200, located within Above the Falls Regional Park, for a one-year term commencing September 15th, 2023, at the rate of $600 per month, gross, including utilities and taxes.
Any questions on this one? Not seeing any lights. All those in favor of Resolution 2023-152, please signify by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed? Abstentions? No, that motion carries. On to the next. Anyone?
I'll move Resolution 2023-148. It's a resolution approving a lease agreement with Matthew Olig, leasing commercial space at 3104 Pacific Street North, Unit 302, located within Above the Falls Regional Park, for a one-year term commencing September 15th, 2023, at the rate of $920 per month gross, including utilities and taxes.
Any questions? Seeing no lights, all those in favor of Resolution 2023-148, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? That motion carries.
I can move Resolution 2023-151, resolution approving lease agreement with Emerald Hulsing, leasing commercial space at 3104 Pacific Street North, Unit 305, located within Above the Falls Regional Park, for a one-year term commencing September 15th, 2023, at the rate of $480 per month gross, including utilities and taxes.
Any questions, comments? Seeing no lights, all those in favor of Resolution 2023-151, please signify by saying aye.
Aye. I'll move Resolution 2023-149 as well. Resolution approving lease agreement with Matthew Olig, leasing commercial space at 3104 Pacific Street North, Unit 307, located within the Above the Falls Regional Park, for a one-year term commencing September 15th, 2023, at the rate of $325 per month gross, including utilities and taxes.
Still seeing no lights. All those in favor of Resolution 2023-149, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? That motion carries. Got one more.
Resolution 2023-150, resolution approving lease agreement with Matthew Olig, leasing commercial space at 3104 Pacific Street North, Unit 308, located within the Above the Falls Regional Park for a one-year term commencing September 15th, 2023 at the rate of $1,100 gross per month, including utilities and taxes.
Seeing no lights. All those in favor?
There's a light.
Oh, there's a light.
I
Forgive
waited
me.
till the end.
I thank you.
I have one question for
and
staff.
please. Yeah, you
Is
should.
Is this similar to the lease agreement we have in Northeast, where the rent is going back to if we ever condemn the building, or?
Chair Thompson and Commissioner Menz, that is correct.
Thank you.
Excellent question. Now I do not see any lights. Oh, nice. And congratulations to our new tenants. But all those in favor of Resolution 2023-150, please signify by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed? That motion carries. I understand these are all artists, so that's phenomenal. Maybe they can do a presentation sometime. Okay. Our amended agenda has two things left. Anyone like to carry or move the next
I'll
one?
move Resolution 2023-153. This is a resolution amending Chapter 17 of the Minneapolis Park and Recreation Board Code of Ordinances, the criteria-based system for capital and rehabilitation neighborhood park project scheduling.
Excellent, and I believe Director Arvidsson has a presentation for us.
Chair Thompson, if you'd like one, I can certainly.
Or just answer questions. Does anyone have any questions about this? I mean, it's exciting. Yes.
I would appreciate it.
Let's have a present. I know you worked very hard on it, so we can hear about it.
Thank you, Chair Thompson, committee members. Just one moment while the computer decides to cooperate with me.
Can't read.
It just wants you to, pull it out from the recesses of your mind.
I would be personally.
Yeah.
I could do it without the computer.
Do we still have the camera? They could shine on it and put it on the screens for us? For people that have hand up?
I can certainly do a brief presentation if you want, and you can follow along with the ordinance information that was in your packet. I can kind of just walk through the things that are in there. I can certainly do that. This is.
He's going to keep beeping at us.
I always try to prepare for that, and it actually hasn't happened to me before that this hasn't started up. But essentially, the action that's before you is to amend Chapter 17. Which is the criteria-based system for neighborhood parks, otherwise known as the equity metrics for neighborhood parks. Chapter 17, just to be clear, it is not a concurrent ordinance with the city. Chapter 16 is a concurrent ordinance and 17 is not. So you are able to amend Chapter 17 on your own without the city also doing that in parallel. There's essentially a few different things that we're proposing to do with the ordinance in this case. We want to address the undeveloped parks investment issue. We want to update the density metric. And then there are three, what I would call housekeeping topics, but I guess you can decide whether they're housekeeping topics or whether they rise to something more important than that. So the resolution does include changes to multiple existing sections, and it writes two new sections, 17-5 and 17-6. And I was going to say that throughout my presentation, I do make notes and citations about what exact sections we're talking about, but that'll be, I guess, less. Oh, I think Secretary Ringgold might be able to get me going here.
Look at that.
Something's happening.
A tech wizard as well, on top of everything else.
Wow. Well, this better be a good presentation then. So essentially, let me start with undeveloped parks, because that's kind of the biggest one, so I'll just do that first. Some of this has been presented to you before, so I'll go through it quickly. Currently, there are 51 parks that can be considered undeveloped according to the definition that we've now written into ordinance. So we had to define undeveloped parks. We define undeveloped parks as lacking all of the following. So these are 6 assets that are significant assets in our system. And so we define an undeveloped park as a park that has none of these assets. The ordinance overall, the chapter 16 and 17, does say that we have to rank and invest in all neighborhood parks. But the major issues, as I've described them to you before, is that undeveloped parks cannot get asset scores, which means that so many of them cluster at the bottom of our rankings and will be invested in one fell swoop very late in NPP 20, which creates, I think, some functional and potentially political issues. So we developed new metrics for the undeveloped parks. The goals of those, and the goal of this ordinance change before you, is to be investing in those undeveloped parks incrementally alongside the rest of the CIP of the developed parks that we always do. But we want to do that in a strategic way and not just pick any old undeveloped parks from year to year. We want to focus development first in areas where there's the greatest community need, and also focus development areas that are otherwise underserved by park facilities. So certainly demographic need is important, but also can an undeveloped park actually serve a recreational importance? Not all of them do. And so we shouldn't necessarily prioritize all of them. So the proposed approach is that there will be 2 neighborhood park lists developed. We essentially separate those out, and that's described in PB 17-4. And then we use new but similar metrics to rank the undeveloped parks. And those are described in PB 17-6, which is a new section. And then once we invest in them, we move them onto the developed list. And so they will see improvements, they will come onto the developed list, and then essentially the second time around for NPP 20, they'll sit in there with all the other parks and they will be able to get asset scores. And that's described in PB 17-5. So for the undeveloped parks metrics, we would keep the same community characteristics metrics, and then we would create 2 new undeveloped park characteristics metrics. The proximity metric, which is described in 17-6B2, would be how many of the 5 major assets are nearby. So is that park in an area that's already well served by parks? And if so, if there are many assets nearby, we would deprioritize that park. It would get a lower score if it is very close to a park with lots of stuff going on. The second piece is asset potential. In our planning effort, and we have now planned every park in the system, if a park is going to have future recreation assets, if the community felt it was important that there was a playground there, or a community garden, or something like that, then we would get a higher score for that park. We would prioritize development of that, as opposed to the parks that might just have a bench or some natural landscaping or be left alone. So we're, again, prioritizing investment in the parks that can fulfill a recreational need. And the recreational assets that would be included in this analysis are, again, those listed in the undeveloped parks definition. So if a park plan says that we're going to put in any of those 6 things, in addition, any kind of paved trails or gathering areas that are internal to the park, so like a walking loop or a plaza with seating and gathering, an off-leash dog area, or community gardens managed by MPRB, those would all count as things that would be considered asset potential if they're called for in the park plan. And the asset potential is simply a binary. If there's anything planned, it would get the maximum 5 points, and if there's nothing planned, it would get 0. So you can see under these metrics, we are still giving more points to the community characteristics. So we are prioritizing historic disinvestment and community need, but then the park characteristics also get 10 points. So in order to test these rankings and make sure they work really well, we've been generating lists of these parks. We've been ranking them and re-ranking them and playing with it. I'm going to show some draft information tonight, but with a couple of caveats. So we have updated our demographic and asset characteristic data for these parks for the current year. We've done that for all of our neighborhood parks. We're in the midst of updating those equity metrics, so we've done that for the undeveloped park. However, our density metric is currently following the current way, or maybe soon to be the old way, because there's also a density change involved in this one, right? The final list is going to be created along with the 2023 equity metric update. So right now, I'm not prepared to show or make public an entire list because it could still change. So instead, so that you know what you're kind of signing up for and approving, I'm going to give you 2 tiers of 10 in alphabetical order, just so you can get a sense of the 51, what are like the top 10 and the top 20 under this ranking. So here's the top 10. I won't read them to you. You can look at them. And again, I'll reiterate, 8th Avenue Streamscape isn't necessarily number 1. It's just alphabetical order. Of this group, there are actually 2 parks that were not previously considered undeveloped. We had some surrogate asset scores for them, but they meet the definition of being undeveloped, so they do need to be on this list. And then in addition, there are several of these parks that currently have CIP allocations. You'll recall I shared with you during the budget retreat that in the year 2027, we actually did bring a slate of undeveloped parks into the CIP just solely based on their ranking, community characteristic ranking. And so some of these parks do have investments already planned. What's interesting and important about this list, I think, is of these 10, there's actually only 1 park that scores in the top 10 without having an asset potential. So 9 out of the top 10 parks are parks that we actually are saying to the public, we're going to build something for you there. And I think that's a testament to how these work, because I think the goal, again, is to prioritize parks where we're actually going to have a recreational impact. So the next 10 are here. And the next 10 maybe get a little bit more obscure, so I can, if you have questions about these, I can kind of talk about them. And to do the same thing, there was a couple that, or 1 that was not previously considered undeveloped, and there are several that are in the CIP allocation. And once again, in the top 20, we only have 1 additional park, so only 2 parks out of the top 20 scored that way, largely on their demographic characteristics. And so both of those parks are triangles on the north side that are sitting within ACP 50 areas. So they score very high on their community characteristics, and that is outweighing their asset potential, their lack of asset potential, but that's actually a rare occurrence. And once you go further down in the list, then you start to see parks that are a little more, that get that 0 score for asset potential. So I want to talk a little bit about funding in the undeveloped parks. So there's a section PB 17-5 that was written about funding. After a lot of internal conversation, what we're opting to do here is to actually not have any specific sources or amounts included in the ordinance revisions. 2 of you who've served on previous boards will remember that this was a major point of discussion with previous boards, and there was a lot of talk about what was the dollar amount, what is the source. Instead of doing that, we've actually decided to have this happen annually through the CIP process. So rather than locking the board into a dollar amount and a source forever now, we're going to have that be an annual process. It allows for you some flexibility to decide maybe this year we need to really bump up the undeveloped parks and maybe next year we need to do a little bit less. So that can flex year over year, depending on what parks are on the list next and depending on what the other needs in the system might be. So we're reserving that to be an annual CIP determination, which I personally think is the appropriate place for it, because then you can decide the source and the amount based on the overall budget picture of the organization in a particular year. We do say that funding needs to be used for capital, not acquisition. And there's this quote here, funding shall be sufficient to transform the park into a developed park. So whenever you see a CIP allocation come through from me, it's going to be in an amount that actually makes that park usable to the public so that it can then move on to the developed list and it will be considered invested under NPP 20. The funding impact, just so everyone is clear, undeveloped parks by ordinance are already going to move into the CIP and get investment at some point during NPP 20. So this ordinance change only modifies when they're going to come in, not that we're bringing in a whole slew of new parks, because they are neighborhood parks and they need investment. So investing in this way at any amount in any year has no impact on when we get through NPP 20. The total dollar amount that we plan to invest in this first round of parks is about the same. This is really just about when we're doing it. Okay, I'm going to move on from undeveloped parks and talk about density, and now we're going to go a lot faster. So density, you'll recall, we have an issue with density in that it is a static system with hard ranges of numbers. This is kind of arbitrary relative to the city density and will also become less impactful if and when the city densifies. In addition, the scoring weirdly ranges from 1 to 3 rather than starting at 0, and no other metric actually does that. So we're proposing a modification to 17-4A4, which creates a tiered system relative to overall density in the city. It'll essentially rank neighborhoods by their density, and then the parks in the top 25 densest neighborhoods would get 3 points, and the bottom 0 points, and the 2 middle ones would get 1 and 2 respectively. This allows our metrics to still have differentiation should the city densify as a whole, rather than clustering everything in the high density scoring. So we don't have to redo this metric regardless of what happens with city density overall. Housekeeping amendments. There are 3, what I at least think are relatively minor amendments included in the action. We want to replace the outdated RCAP language, which has really fallen out of favor in equity circles, with the more commonly used ACP and ACP 50. It does exactly the same thing, but ACP stands for Area of Concentrated Poverty, and ACP 50 is an area of concentrated poverty where more than 50% of the population are people of color. RCAP, which stands for Racially Concentrated Area of Poverty, is felt by people living in those areas often that it puts blame on the people that are living there. And so it has fallen out of favor with HUD and with Met Council, and so we just want to clean that up and evolve the language. Secondly, there was a previous amendment to the ordinance that made direction to staff very difficult to implement functionally, and so we want to clean that up a little bit. That's at the end of section 17-4, and then that same language is mirrored in 17-6. And then the last one is a modification to the overall community characteristics directive. You may remember me talking about this one, and it was actually exposed through conversations with the city's CLIC committee. They found a discrepancy between what the ordinance was saying and how we have to calculate the ACP 50s by census tract. So the ordinance language reads that every neighborhood park within a neighborhood gets the same community score, but that's not actually functionally possible with the ACP 50s, nor is it the way that we've ever done it. It creates situations like this where in the Whittier neighborhood, you'll remember this graphic perhaps, we have parks that may get 3 different ACP 50 scores, and yet the ordinance as written would require us to give them all the same score. But which score? The highest or the lowest? It's not clear on that. So instead, what we'd like to do is modify a couple of sections. One section would say simply that each neighborhood park shall receive a score for each community characteristic. So it's getting a score for its particular demographic location and not the larger neighborhood. And then the ACP 50 metric gets changed to reference census tracts specifically and not neighborhoods. And as I mentioned during our budget retreat, this may create, or so I shouldn't say create, but discovering this discrepancy means that there may have been errors in the past in how we operationalized the rankings, and we are investigating that now. And if there are parks that should have been invested under the letter of the ordinance, but were not, we will correct that in the next CIP that you see. So we're going to kind of polish up what was done before, but I think going forward it's most appropriate to really have each neighborhood get its own score, each park get its own score. Next steps. If this passes through committee tonight, we expect at September 6th to have the first full board reading, and a public hearing will take place at that time. Ordinance revisions take 3 meetings, so then on September 20th, we would have a final full board meeting. And you can see that I'm before you here tonight because we're starting to get close to our budget. After September 20th, we will use this amended ordinance to create the very next ranking and CIP, which will be presented to you on October 18th alongside the superintendent's recommended budget. And at that time, there will be a CIP that follows rankings that will be presented to you that all follow this new ordinance. And with that, I will stand for questions and thank Secretary Ringgold for the assist on the technology.
Any questions? Commissioner Co-Chair Schaefer.
Yeah, thank you. I just want to really appreciate the detail and the depth, Director Arvinson, in this report, and the amount of time it must have taken to put this all together. I have one question, comment, and maybe other colleagues would like to comment, but I am wondering about this focus of prioritizing parks that serve a recreational need as part of our asset potential. We do not have very many passive parks within our system. And as our constituents continue to age and continue to have density issues, I'm just raising the question from my own experience at Thomas Lowry Park of how much comments we get of this is such a quiet space, I can come here and just sit, try to listen to the birds, kind of pull away from some of the noise that can be happening in people's lives. And so, I just think about, has this created deficits for us in some of our natural areas? If we have prioritized these assets that bring recreational need. I'm not saying it's a bad way to look at it. I'm just kind of raising the question that I'd like us to at least be thoughtful about that, because maybe you know off the top of your head how many parks are passive. I know Washburn Fair Oaks and Thomas Lowry. Those are the only 2 that I can think of, but that's District 4.
Chair Thompson, Commissioner Schaefer, the effort to create community-driven plans for all of our parks I think is really a strong guide for which parks will be more passively oriented or which portions of parks will be. So there are also some large parks, I think about Kenwood Park, which has some very active recreation areas, but also some areas where you can kind of escape into the woods and have a very passive type of environment. So, and I think in addition, our inclusion of accessible gathering spaces and seating as being one of the asset potential options recognizes that actually might be how people want to recreate in a more passive way. So we would still prioritize those parks where we've said, we don't want to do anything here, but still allow people an accessible, safe way to gather. Those parks actually would be prioritized, but they're not going to get all of a sudden a playground because they've already been planned to not have those things. Thomas Lowry, interestingly, is considered a developed park because it has an aquatic facility. So sometimes the definition of developed or undeveloped doesn't, it's not that the undeveloped parks are passive and the developed parks are active, because I think there's often a mix in our system of both in many parks.
My only feedback to that would be then I think any piece of land, any piece of turf could be considered a gathering place, right, for any park, whether that's a triangle, whether that's a, so that's to me, that asset potential category, I don't know, it's just something that I think about, and I'm not down in the weeds as far as you are in it, but I will review these slides and I will, because I can't remember right off the top of my head what those categories of asset potential were, and maybe they were, do you have them on a slide?
I do. Sorry everyone for the dizziness. Chair Thompson, Commissioner Schaefer, I've put the asset potential assets on the screen for you, and it's the 6 that we use to define undeveloped parks. So buildings, open air shelters, courts, aquatics, fields, play areas. And then we've also added, if a park's plan calls for some kind of paved accessible trail or gathering area, not the sidewalks, but can you come into that park on a loop or gathering area, the off-leash dog areas and community gardens would also qualify that park to be prioritized, to get a score under the asset potential metric. And I think the thinking behind some of that versus, and we had big internal debates about landscape areas and turf areas. I think we were thinking about when we invest in a park, sometimes that investment, for better or for worse, is infrastructural. There's kind of like a hard element to it, and so we wanted to prioritize those parks that again would have that kind of investment, and parks that are meant to be just triangles of grass, like the Shoreview triangles in District 6, District 5. Those will just kind of be how they are. And when we get to them, there might be minor things to do, like install a bench, but I think our suggestion is that we don't tackle those first, that instead we tackle the ones where we're actually saying we need to build a playground because there's a gap.
Yeah, and I just think as we look to large cities, that I think these quiet urban spaces are more and more desired as density increases, and I see potential for the commons in that way, right? So I just wanted to make that comment and tell you thank you for your work.
Welcome.
Vice President Crudup.
Thank you. Thanks for your presentation. Just one maybe clarifying question was when we define like close proximity, I see that it says a 10-minute walk. Is that 10-minute walk regular human size or tiny human size? Because those are different.
They are. Chair Thompson and Vice President Crudup. You know what? I'd have to look a little bit more into. So what we're using a mapping software where there's kind of a standardized 10-minute walk. And as I also presented to you at the budget retreat, we're exploring possibly going to a walkshed analysis for other metrics. So we're doing that analysis now, and I can say to you that I don't actually, not being the GIS technician that Joe Ayers is, I don't actually know what pace of walk they're using. I know that major barriers like large roadways and stuff are all considered, and that it's a true 10-minute walk, like if you're on the sidewalks, it's not a perfect circle.
Yeah.
But I can follow up on your question because I don't know what type of human they're using to gauge the 10-minute walk. It's a great question.
Yeah. I'm just curious as I think about the mobility of young people and smaller young people when we talk about accessibility and just kind of moving around, whether it's walking or rolling in a chair or a scooter or whatever, however someone is getting there, I'm thinking, is it the same for an adult versus maybe a group of youth whose family may be okay with like, hey, you're just going this far. So thank you.
Other questions, comments? Seeing none, this is a good discussion, and thank you for the presentation. A lot of details, and I know there's a lot of work in the weeds, as it were. Let's take this for a vote. All those in favor of Resolution 2023-153, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Abstentions? That motion carries.
I would like to move the final resolution of the evening, resolution directing staff to require Board of Commissioner approval for any action relating to an encroachment immediately adjacent to water bodies, including an action to issue a construction permit, beginning on the date following approval of this resolution and extending for a period of not more than 365 days. I will give just a little bit of background, and then I will answer any questions my colleagues may have. The spirit of this resolution has grown out of the passage of the Cedar Isles master plan and some of the detail that we had put in the plan about restoring the shoreline to natural kind of environment. And I will just read the 4 primary actions. I'm sure you all have read them, but I will just read them just for clarification in case there's any questions. The primary actions would be involved that, number 1, the Board of Commissioners directs staff to investigate and inventory all encroachments immediately adjacent to water bodies to determine if proper licenses exist and report to the Board of Commissioners its findings prior to December 31st, 2023. The Board of Commissioners directs staff to prepare and present to the Board of Commissioners a workflow supporting Resolution 2021-368, resolution revoking all permissions for use of Minneapolis Park and Recreation Board parkland immediately adjacent to water bodies upon the sale, transfer of ownership, and other conveyance of property prior to December 31st, 2023. And this was a resolution that happened at the end of 2021. And thirdly, that the Board of Commissioners directs staff to prepare and disseminate communications to property owners abutting MPRB parkland immediately adjacent to water bodies, addressing encroachments and the inventory of such properties to determine the presence and extent of encroachments with dissemination prior to October 1st, 2023. And finally, the Board of Commissioners directs staff to require Board of Commissioner approval for any action relating to an encroachment immediately adjacent to water bodies, including an action to issue a construction permit beginning on the date following the approval of this resolution, and then period not more than 365 days. So those are the main bulk of actions around this resolution. And
Thank you. Thank you, Coach. Commissioner Musich.
Thank you, Co-Chair Thompson. I actually have a question for staff. I do see that you are recommending that we move forward with the resolution, but since it's coming from a commissioner versus from staff, I'm just wondering if you understand what the ramifications of this are to the way that you do work. Are we looking at extended timelines around construction projects? Do we anticipate that that's going to have any additional cost for the board on things where you might be issuing permits for work, or not permits for work, but things related to encroachments near water bodies? Like, what are the operational impacts of what we're considering before us today?
Chair Thompson and Commissioner Musich, I think the major thing related to the issuance of construction permits in these unique conditions would be the time it takes to prepare a board action. But I think we have the bulk of it already in this document in terms of how we would present it to the board and the need for following through in that. So while that would take a little bit of extra time, I think there's 2 things that become operative. Number 1, we don't get that many encroachments that are near water bodies or permission requests to encroach upon water bodies. And number 2, once we have a template figured out, it should be pretty straightforward for any subsequent times during this period. I think the other thing, just relative to how staff would be responding to this, Councilor Rice and I had a discussion about this last week, and I think to kind of paraphrase what Councilor Rice says, we've been moving toward this point for decades, and we've been recognizing it, even in my time here over the last 9 or so years, that it's time that we start dealing with this. It's been an issue in the community for a long time. Having a very direct policy basis in the plan for Cedar and Isles makes it really clear that we have the time now to move forward.
Okay, great. Thank you for that additional information. I appreciate it.
Any other questions, comments? Yes, Commissioner Benny.
Thank you, Co-Chair Thompson. I'm not on this committee, but I think that was I'm glad to hear from Assistant Superintendent Schroeder on that and those particular comments. And actually, I'm not going to have a chance to vote on this now, but I'm hoping it comes forward to the full board. And actually, I really appreciate Commissioner Schaefer raising this opportunity, because that's what it is. And I think it's really, it's perfect timing from the Cedar Isles plan adoption to start to do this. And it should actually be helpful to those who have encroachments against water bodies, because it'll help them understand the level of their investment and what their risk is associated with having that encroachment. So I just wanted to say those comments and say thank you to Commissioner Schaefer.
Well, I think it's a look backwards a little bit from some of our previous resolutions, as well as this recent strong action around Cedar Isles, and hopefully it will tie together these loose ends. And I'm excited for the opportunity that it will be for these homeowners to actually participate in this process. So,
Thank you. Seeing no other lights, all those in favor of the water body Schaefer resolution, please signify by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed? That motion carries. And seeing nothing else on our amended agenda, I will call the meeting adjourned.
Nice work.
Thank you.
why is she smiling over there?
You know, it's not great.